I'm going to guide this one. This is a practice I call rep practice. You know when you're in a gym and you do like reps and you do, I haven't been to a gym in a long time, but you know where you work really hard and then you rest, and then you work hard and you rest. Working hard is not what we're going to do, but we're going to try to stay present with the sensation of the breath for 1 or 2 breaths, and then we're going to drop it, but we're still going to stay still the whole time, and I'll guide us through it. So first, again, just slowly coming into the space. Remember, with meditation, we're not going anywhere. We're arriving. So if you want to shut down the eyes, or if you want, you can just gaze down in front of you with slightly unfocused eyes. And just relax. If you need a sigh, you want to stretch your neck out a little bit, stretch your jaw, maybe give a quick face massage, and just notice any tension or any place where you're holding excitement or tension, and just try to relax. And then just feel this kind of often either quiet or obvious gratitude that exists in the heart of us being together and having a little space today to explore some really beautiful ideas. And then now we're just going to let the mind wander. We're not trying to do anything. We're just sitting here, letting the mind wander. But if you can, just notice where it wanders. And just gently cultivate this kind of feeling of spaciousness in terms of everything's allowed. There's no distractions, there's nothing unallowed happening. Just a feeling of allowing everything to exist as it is. And again, just letting the mind wander, be at ease. All right, now in a minute, whenever you're ready, let's work with the abdomen. I want you to try to stay with the physical sensation of a breath. And we're gonna kind of do it the opposite. We're gonna stay with the exhale and then the inhale. So just try to stay with that whole process of exhaling and inhaling, and then let the mind wander again. So whenever you're ready, just stay physically present to an entire breath. And then we're going to do that again, but we'll try to do 3 breaths. So again, you're just letting the mind wander. And then whenever you're ready, try to stay present to the physical sensation of exhaling and inhaling in 3 consecutive breaths. And then when you're done with that, just let the mind wander again. Great, and we're going to do that one more time. And try, see if you can do it for 5 breaths. Again, letting the mind wander, then staying present for 5 consecutive breaths, and then letting the mind wander again. And then in the last couple minutes, just kind of doing it on your own. Perhaps you can even do 1 breath and then a few breaths, just mind wandering, and then come back and try to do 1 more breath again. Just play with it however it works for you, just in the last couple minutes. All right, and before we finish, just take a moment, however that went for you, however you think it went, especially notice if you have any self-criticism, just drop that. We succeeded in our practice the moment we arrived onto our chairs. So just take one moment and appreciate your effort in that little practice. So just take a moment to authentically appreciate yourself. And feel some sense of accomplishment. Okay, great. Thank you. I did notice online it said this morning started at 9. So I think we'll see. We might have some people show up at 9. I think there might have been a little confusion. Let's go. Any thoughts? Or?
I became an ice skater making figure eights.
Uh-huh. Like that was what your mind wandering was?
Yeah, that's never happened.
Uh-huh, yeah.
When I really focused on the breath, beautiful marking
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
became the breath.
Yeah, some people have like visualizations come with the breath and really tune into that. Yeah. Yeah, great. And there's nothing wrong with that. You don't want to, and we'll get into this. Here's a couple of the enemies of meditation. Trying to have insight. It really is, oddly enough. Like anytime we have ideas, like, oh, wow. That's just distraction. That's just another form. In Sanskrit, it's called prapancha. It's just another type of distraction. It's like, whoa, that's amazing. Something's happening, or all the different levels of insight. Just trivia. Murray used to always say it's just trivia. He had a beautiful English accent, which I can't mimic, but he would say, it's just trivia, old boy, it's just trivia. I'd be like, Murray, something amazing happened in meditation. He's like, it's just trivia, old boy. So it's just letting that go again and again. But yeah.
I like the relaxed permission of it.
Totally, exactly, yeah.
All the different ways that I've learned to meditate. I've never done that practice before,
Yeah.
and I really liked it.
Yeah.
I think that feeling of coming back to the breath.
Yeah.
And then, okay, it's okay, let go.
Totally,
It's
just
okay.
relax, yeah.
The whole relaxation of just being allowed to wander. Nobody's ever said that.
Yeah.
All the meditation.
Great,
stuff I've
yeah.
done all these years, no teacher has ever said it's okay to let your mind wander.
Yeah.
You're supposed to shoot yourself if your mind wanders.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so I've had many really, really wonderful meditation teachers over the years. And, a couple of times somebody will say something to you that just hits you. And I was studying with a wonderful woman named Marcia Rose, really very accomplished meditator. And she said, we're not trying to focus, and this is such a key point, we're not trying to focus on the breath. And again, there's a quality of, for lack of a better word, masculine or feminine energies, right? Masculine energy, we can say, it's related in kind of Jungian psychology to ascension. It's related to solar energy, spirit, right? So, and again, think about if I said to you, that person is very spirited. Well, you would have a sense of that person is like able to accomplish things, right? So it's an upward moving energy. And then there's a yin or feminine energy, which is related with lunar cycles, and it's related to calming and soul. So again, think about the difference between spirit and soul, which used to be very articulated, but now we kind of mix them up sometimes. But if I said to you, that person is very spirited, and then if I said, this person is very soulful, feel the difference there, right? The soulful feels like a presencing, right? Who would you want is the CEO? You might want the spirited person to get everybody on board. Who would you want is a therapist, or who would you want is somebody that you could talk to when you're having a hard time? You want that soulful energy. So oftentimes when we hear the instruction focus on the breath, right? Is that spirit or soul? Tricky. Yes, spirit. It's projecting your energy out. Focus on something. And Marcia Rose says, she's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm focusing on the breath, you know? She said, no, no, no. She says, receive the sensation of the breath. Notice how different that is. It's like you're relaxing and you're opening up to receiving the sensation, as opposed to trying to do something. It's just a receptive energy. It might sound subtle, but it's really, really potent. So that's, you know, as Cecily was talking, it reminding me of that. We're trying to really just open. Another wonderful, very profound meditation teacher named Shayla Catherine, she said to me once, she says, meditation is not about the accumulation of accomplishment, okay, which normally we think it is in a way. She said, but rather the refinement of relinquishment. Letting go. What I said yesterday, meditation is working on specific cognitive and emotional skills for the purpose of awakening. What is one of those skills? Learning to let go. Right? And we don't think of letting go as a skill, but it really is something we need to cultivate. So we need to make a spirited effort to create a soulful, you see, and there's a paradox here, and this is a paradox you cannot get away from. And the paradox is any attempt to create a non-agitated state of mind is itself an agitated state of mind. Okay, I'm going to say that again because it's like a tongue twister. Because it's like, wait, what are you trying to do in meditation? You're trying to become a less agitated person on one level. How do you do that? By letting go of wanting to become a less agitated person. Because really what we're trying to do with meditation is we're trying to become intimate with what's actually happening. And if you've noticed, what actually is happening is oftentimes not very pleasant. Almost every time somebody comes to me and they start to develop a serious interest in meditation, meaning they're doing at least 1 or 2 hours a day, within a couple of weeks, they say, I'm becoming a much worse person. I see it happen over and over. They say, I used to be a really nice, kind person, and now I'm just not. And really what's happening, everybody goes through this. What's really happening is you're just discovering who you actually always were. Right? You're just realizing, oh no, you're realizing how neurotic you actually are. I remember that my first ever 10-day silent retreat, I did a Goenka style. Many of you have probably done it, where you do 10 hours for 10 days. And you're silent the whole time. And I finished, and the first thing I said to my friend was, I said, I need therapy. Because I just realized what a mess I was. You know, I was just a mess. And it wasn't like I wasn't a mess before. I just had enough trivia where I didn't notice how much of a mess I was. Anything else come up in that?
I had this experience where you were saying focus on the exhale.
Yeah.
And for me, when you focus inhale,
Right.
it's kind of a downward motion, and then it's the reverse.
Yeah.
And it felt like I had this, almost like a fish hook, like a J was going on in my head, where I ended up on a swing each time. When I was focusing on the different side of the breath you had us focus on. Normally, I think you said start with the exhale.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
So the upwards of the inhale, filling up. And
Yeah,
so
great.
I had this much more positive feeling of filling up.
Yeah, great. We'll let them get settled, and when we'll. Yeah.
When you did the breath, and then you said we could wander,
Yeah.
and so there was a different relaxation that happened inside my body.
Yeah.
And then I felt this joy arising. That's the state I'm in right now.
Yeah, great,
So
yeah.
I just felt joy arising, and I smiled.
Yeah, great.
And now I was wondering, that's the state I'm in now, but if I were grieving,
Yeah.
would perhaps it would be different and the grief would arise?
Yeah.
You understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, I do. These are all really good points. So
That
let me.
relaxation is an allowing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
So whatever state we're in, perhaps then it has a moment then to express itself, to arrive
Yeah.
in a very relaxed and almost comforting.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the key word there is allowing. So we'll let people get settled and then we'll jump in again. Good morning, everybody. First of all, does everybody have a reading? Okay, great. All right, so online it said we started at 9 and then we talked about yesterday starting at 8:30. So sorry if we started without you this morning. We just did a little meditation, and now we're just talking about it. So a couple of points came up. Judy, right? Is it Judy? Or tell me your name again. Phyllis. I'm sorry. Very not Judy. There's Judy. Hi, Judy. Yeah. Phyllis.
I'll be a Phyllis anytime.
I'll be a Judy.
So Phyllis and Cecily just brought up a couple points that I want to touch on. Phyllis brought up, she said, well, it's interesting that we started, right? Because I said start on the exhale. So normally when I say take a breath, what do? You go inhale and exhale, right? And I said, let's switch that. And I said that, and Phyllis noticed that was different, right? And why do I do that? Because there's all these points. What happens is anytime we're done something, anytime we're finished with a project, there's a little part of the mind that shuts down. Now, this is going to sound very subtle, but it's very true. When we inhale and exhale, we're done with a project. And that's when you start to become the mind starts to wake up to subtle movements, you realize that's almost always the exact point where the mind goes into mind wandering. At the end of the exhale. After a long time of practice, you can start to see exactly what point the mind moves off the object and goes into mind wandering. It's 97% at that point, at the end of the exhale, which is so interesting. So the way the reason we reverse that is because then we normally don't think of the inhale as the end of a project. Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to do some writing right now, and I was reading Faulkner, who's his thoughts on writing, he says never finish writing when you're finished with what you need to say for that day. Always finish right before you're finished with what you need to say. In other words, know exactly what the next sentence is you want to write, and finish before you write that next sentence. Because then when the next morning you're excited to write that sentence which you wanted to write last night. You see what I mean? But if I write that next sentence and I'm like, okay, I'm done with that section, the next day, and I've tried this, it's so true, you're like, I don't really know what comes next. I'll get to that. I'll do that later today. And then like 7 weeks later, you're like, I got to get to that next sentence. And I do that with construction now too. There's always construction on the farm. So if I get to a point, like if I'm getting close to a point of like, I don't know how to proceed, I always make sure to stop before that. So I was like, well, I just have to cut this 2x4 and then nail that in, and it just gets you going. So it's a similar thing in practice. When we exhale and inhale, we want to exhale, like we're going to stay present. It sounds very subtle, but it's not. It really becomes quite useful. So then we exhale. So again, what are we talking about? We're talking about the ways we count the breath when we're working with counting the breath. So exhale, inhale 1. Exhale, inhale 2, like that. Now, Cecily brought up something, 2 points. Well, one, she says when she was just, and correct me if I don't have this right, but she said when she was relaxing, there was just a joy coming up, because that's where she's at right now. But she says if there was grief, like the grief might arise, And so, yes, this whole practice that we're talking about as a more yin feminine approach of receptivity is just allowing whatever's present. But there's a difference between that and engaging it. You see, we're just allowing, but we're not engaging it. We're not touching it. And there's a place and there's practices for engaging and touching. But in this, we're just allowing, we're not paying much attention to the emotional states that are rising and falling. This is very tricky when you start to get into some more states that create ecstasy. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we look at the levels. but because we feel like that's the goal of practice somehow. It's not, but when we start to move into these states that create ecstasy, there's a feeling of wanting to engage that. There's this feeling of like, I've made it, I've succeeded. I've even had the delusional thought of, I'm fully awakened. It doesn't take long. All you have to do is go hang out with your family and you realize, oh, that was not the case. But, when those ecstatic states come and they just start flushing through you, for days, you feel like something. And then again, I just remember Murray's voice in my head. It's all trivia, old boy. It's all trivia, You just let that go too. He was mentioning the Advaita Vedanta slogan, neti neti, which means not this, not that. And you just notice the mind always wanting to grab something. Yeah, anything else from that little practice we did? Yeah.
So I found myself getting annoyed by all the little sounds that were around.
Great, yeah.
And I was trying to not think about it, but the more I tried to not think about it,
Yeah.
I was thinking about it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, sounds are wonderful, and it was such a great environment for this morning's meditation. I teach a weekly class in my hometown when I'm there, and I encourage people to not turn off their cell phones, just so we can relax. Somebody's phone is ringing, and there's this weird thing about allowing things to, not having to feel like you have to have a commentary about it. So here we had but I do appreciate Mark fixing it, but we had the rattling light.
Oh, it'll come back.
And we had, little phone activity and, rustling. And there was a wonderful rascal of a meditation teacher named Chogyam Trungpa. And he used to, when he would guide meditations, he would ask one of his students to vacuum in the hallway. And he instructed him to continually hit the wall where on the other side people were meditating. Just to hit that point of like irritability, and really that's what we're working so much with, that irritability. And it took me a long time to actually hit this point of letting go. But I did a 10-day meditation retreat, this one I was telling you about, where it's 10 hours a day, it's the Goenka style. And there's this kid in front of me, and you have little name tags, but you're silent the whole time. And you have little name tags. So I knew his name was Scotty. And the whole time he was cracking his knuckles. And I don't mean like once every 30 minutes. I mean like once every 15 minutes for 10 hours a day for 10 days. And so in my mind, I called him Scotty Knuckles, And so I went up to the teacher, and I knew they were going to pull this stunt of like, he's your practice. So I didn't want to like deal with that. So I said, hey, I need to switch seats, And they're like, oh, why? I'm like, it's hard to explain. Just let me switch seats, And I said, because this guy's cracking his knuckles. They said, he is your practice. And I was like, I knew you were going to say that. I didn't take 10 days out of my life, my busy life, to work with Scotty, I would have called him and gone to couples therapy or something. But I came here to have a little peace and quiet, But it was really one of the greatest gifts, because I finally got to a place where I could let that be, and I realized I don't have to have a commentary. But I had 9 days of angry commentary. Why is he here? Like, what, it's just so frustrated. And then I started having, I wanted to slash his tires. And, it got dark. I was just, so frustrated. And then I realized I can let Scotty be who he is. I don't have to have a commentary. And that was life-saving when I got into a 3-year retreat, that little lesson. And not to say it doesn't come up again, but I just remember, I actually don't have to comment on this. Let me give you, because it's a really important point, let me give you one more angle on that same point. My partner and I walk every morning, and sometimes we're at the farm, and sometimes we're in town. So when we're in town, we walk in neighborhoods. And one morning we were walking, and we noticed we were commenting on every single house. And we're like, oh, I love that fence. And we're like, I don't know about the color of those shutters. And then it's like, wow, I don't know, I wouldn't have put the tree there. And at one point we're like, wow, do we have to comment on everything? Do we have to have an opinion about it? And we just together, we decided, let's just stop the opinion generating machine for the rest of the walk. And it's a similar energy. Again, it's not bad to have opinions, and especially if you're a designer, you want to constantly be exercising that. But you want to be able to turn it off when you need to. Yeah.
And I'm thinking how wonderful it is that we can all do that, and the grace for me would be when I wake up and know I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's the key, yeah,
And
right.
then I have the space
Mm-hmm.
to choose to go on doing it. Mostly what I think is, I just think I'm ridiculously funny.
Yeah,
I laugh.
right, yeah, yeah.
Me doing that. But then I have a choice.
Yeah, no, and that's the key thing. What we're trying to do is we're not trying to change anything. We're just trying to become aware of what's actually happening. Yeah, yeah.
Mind if I kind of flip the brain on it?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I think the brain gets a bad rap.
Of course.
Somewhere along the line.
Yeah, yeah.
In meditation, because we talk about how it's always wandering off. Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So you said exhale, inhale, at that pause, the mind goes and wanders off.
Yeah.
Normally. It just dawned on me that maybe because the mind knows there's something else it would like to get out of this breathing cycle
Yeah.
and get to.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like, we're not in this breathing cycle until we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in it.
Yeah.
And stuck, kind of, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
And every time we pause that breathing cycle, the brain's like, oh, thank God, let me get to what's really important.
Yeah, right,
You know?
right, yeah.
And we're like, no, stay here and exhale again.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and the
Yeah.
brain's like, oh my God, how long are we going to do this?
Yeah.
You don't know what's on the other side. I'm trying to get us there.
Yeah,
And you keep me pinned here in this breathing cycle,
totally.
you know?
Yeah, and especially in Fairfield County. We need to get to the other, we got something to get to, you know? And yeah, and that's what's so frustrating for the mind is that there's like, I'm trying to get somewhere. There's a really, on that exact same point, there's an interesting eating exercise where you eat mindfully and slowly. Like you might take 60 seconds per bite. When I was 16, I started going to Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York with a really wonderful Roshi, John Dado Lori, if anybody knows him. A very strict monastery, and I'm 16, but you have to eat like this, you know? And like, yeah, it was like, but what I noticed, something very interesting, and I called it the gap of forgetting, right? So here's what happens, and I love eating, like it's a big, I'm not unique in that, but I happen to really love it. So I'm always so excited for mealtime, and then let's say I have a fork full of like the most exciting bite. Right? So here I am, I'm bringing up the fork, I'm about to make contact with this thing that I want to make contact with, okay? And then right when it hits, it's inevitable that I'm gonna make contact, what I discovered is the mind flies off and starts thinking about the next bite. Which is fascinating because it means I'm actually never making contact with the thing that I'm wanting to make contact with. I'm living my life as an anticipation machine. I'm never actually in the moment that I want to be in. Dr. Matt Killingsworth from Harvard did some really interesting studies on mind wandering, and he found people mind wander even in sex. Maybe not, that's not surprising, but even in sex they want to be in, even in exciting sex, or even in eating, all these pleasurable activities people mind wander for exactly this reason, because there's a part of the mind that's like, okay, let me get to the next thing. And we have such a hard time actually settling into it. Once you settle into the breath, you realize that a simple sensation like the breath is so utterly fulfilling. So it's this game. And now to your other point of that the mind gets a bad rap, there is a place for mind wandering. And I do active mind wandering every day at the farm. It's one of my daily practices. And it's actually an old Tibetan practice called sky gazing. But I literally lay down in the grass in my backyard and I just watch the sky and I mind wander. And some really interesting studies have come out on showing how healthy that is for the mind. Now notice that's a different quality than waking up at 3 in the morning and thinking I have prostate cancer. Because that's also mind wandering, but I'm being captured by a perseverating thought, which leads to another perseverating thought, and I get pulled in, I'm getting captured. As opposed to this kind of spacious, just letting the mind wander. And this comes back to what Cecily was saying of being aware of it happening as opposed to it being captured by it. Yeah.
I was able to give myself a lot of grace in meditating by that attitude, like recognizing when the mind wanders, that's the practice.
Yeah.
I heard that somewhere.
Yeah.
And when I realized that the mind's job is to think,
Yeah.
it's okay if it thinks,
Yeah.
and then my practice improved.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't fighting.
Great. Yeah, you were just, and what you were doing was you were labeling what was happening. You're like, oh, there's the mind thinking.
The mind's just thinking, that's
Yeah.
what the mind does.
Yeah.
I recognized it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's another practice called Mahasi noting practice, and that's the essence of it, is you're not trying to control. Again, we're not trying to control practice, but you're noting it by labeling. And you'd just be like, oh, thinking mind, craving mind, averse mind. You just note those things. Another noting practice is you note whether your mind is in the past or the future. And it can just be a nice way of just not engaging it, but acknowledging it. And you're not saying, past, get back here. And you're not saying, future, get back here. You're just noting, oh, mind in the past. Mind in the future.
Could I insert
Yeah,
the word
yeah.
compassion?
Yeah, right. Self-compassion, yeah.
Just that, when I notice that I'm all over the place in my head, and I'm aware of that, I have a couple of choices. One is I'm bad.
Yeah.
You know, as you have said.
Totally, yeah.
Or I can just smile at myself compassionately.
Yeah, yeah.
And let it go.
Yeah. Yeah, and then when you realize that that's just the nature of mind, too, to do that, then you don't even need compassion because there's nothing to be, or forgiveness, because there's nothing to forgive because the mind is just doing what the mind does. Like you wouldn't forgive a puppy for being rambunctious. You see what I mean? You're not like, okay, I'm going to have compassion for your little puppy. You're like, no, you're like, the puppy is being puppiness, right? But self-forgiveness is such a huge aspect of practice. And I just recently worked with a group of 30 tech entrepreneurs. These are all kids that are just building, the latest apps and stuff. And it was amazing. Almost all of them are struggling. I worked with each one of them individually to figure out what practice to do. And I would say most of them I had on a self-forgiveness practice. They were plagued with, and these kids were making huge amounts of money. I mean, ungodly amounts of money. They were highly successful in that regard. And they just hated themselves, and it was just like, just stop beating yourself up, like learning self-forgiveness. And that's a beautiful type of practice. Yeah, were you going to say something? So I want to do that practice again. And is everybody clear on the practice? Those of you that just came in, I'll talk about it again. We're doing I call a rep practice. So you're letting the mind wander and just letting it go wherever it wants. But what's your name? Lori. So similar to what Lori says, is you're just observing it. I call it like a Jane Goodall observation. So Jane Goodall's not like trying to get the chimps to stop fighting. She's not like trying to hey, you guys should maybe go over this direction. Or she's just observing. She's just there observing so we're trying to do that. We're observing the mind wandering. We're not trying to direct it. Let the mind wander anywhere it wants and try to observe it. Now you're going to get pulled into the dialogue. You're going to get pulled into it and then you lose the observing capacity. No problem. Just try to remember, come back whenever you can. That's not the main thing. The main thing is we're going to let the mind wander and then we're going to just try to stay fully present to the sensation of 1 to 5 breaths. Whatever you'd like. And just now work with the idea of receiving the breath as opposed to focusing on the breath. Okay, so just try to really, this time around, try to really work on and it's a kind of, I see it almost as a kind of grace. The breath is, especially if you've ever been in a situation where you're having a hard time breathing, breath can really be a grace. So really receive the grace of that breath. That reminds me, 2 quick things. If you have anxiety and the breath creates anxiety, work with something else. And if you're having breathing problems, work with something else. It doesn't matter so much. Another thing you can work with is a sensation in the left palm of your hand. The sensation at the bottom of your feet. It doesn't really matter what the object of meditation is. So if the breath isn't working for you, I'm going to talk about the breath, but feel free to use something else. All we're using that for is an anchor to come back to again and again. But make it a physical thing. Don't do a visualization, just for now. So just work with the actual physical sensation. Stay with it for 1 or 2 breaths, and then let the mind wander. And then when you're ready, come back into presencing for 1 or 2 breaths, or maybe 5 breaths. If you really want to be ambitious, you could try like 8 breaths, and then just relax and come in. And we'll just, do a kind of natural flow of that. I'm going to talk a little bit less this time, but I'll do maybe 1 reminder halfway through. Sounds are not a problem. That said, try to stay still as much as you can. So first, stretch the neck. Again, it's nice. We'll get a little bit more stretching in today than we normally do. Maybe stretch the arms. Crack your knuckles if you need to crack your knuckles. Stretch the jaw. And then just come into a... Keep the back straight. And just enjoy yourself. Just take a minute just to enjoy yourself. Enjoy the communion here of people. It's such a joy to be together. Just enjoy that. And then whenever you're ready, and if you haven't already, just whenever you're ready, come into a full, maybe 3 breaths. Try to just be fully present. Exhale, inhale 1. Exhale, inhale 2. In your own time, and then let the mind wander. And just a couple more minutes, and if you've gotten lost into mind wandering, just come back, enjoy being an observer of the mind as opposed to being captured by it. And then whenever you're ready, just stay with the sensation of maybe 3 or 5 breaths. And in the last minute, just drop everything, forget about everything, stay totally still, and just let yourself relax. And regardless of how the critical mind might have thought that this practice went, just appreciate being here for it. Appreciate the success of the practice. Just take a moment to authentically bring up some appreciation. All right, great. Any thoughts about that or questions? Yeah.
I love saying that reality.
Yeah.
One of these is going to be the last one.
The breath, yeah.
And I love to really drop into them.
Yeah.
And just kind of be there.
Yeah.
Almost like scare yourself.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But just literally go right to that place.
Yeah.
And just sit there and know that one of these slide does not go on eternally.
Yeah.
And just kind of
Yeah.
and it helps me realize this space.
Yeah. Yeah, and any technique you can use to bring yourself in, like, oh, this is it. Yeah, great. Anything else? Yeah.
So that, for me, was way more successful because I found
Yeah.
noises I was
Yeah, just
not
be
really
with it.
bothering.
Yeah. And also the first time you were kind of like, oh, what is this practice? Now you know it a little bit more. And as you practice, this is a wonderful practice for like if you're waiting at a hospital or something and you have like 10 minutes, do it for a couple minutes. And just like, oh, let me stay with 1 or 2 breaths. And again, it's that rep training. So you are training the mind to be able to relinquish, the refinement of relinquishment. It is that training, and so it's really helpful. Yeah, anything else? Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
Except my house.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Any
Uh,
suggestions?
well,
Or does that become my practice?
yeah, that's become Scotty Knuckles, unfortunately. So I spent many years studying what's called Lojong practices, which is how to do radical, loving practices in very difficult positions. For example, one of my main teachers is a man who lives in my town named Garchen Rinpoche, and he spent 20 years being tortured in prison, and that's where he learned Lojong. And he had he was in a Chinese prison, a Tibetan man. He had a chance to escape, and he didn't. And we asked him why he didn't escape. He said, because at that point, I was in such a wonderful place, and it was such a great place for practice. I couldn't have thought of being in a better position. And I'm like just trying to forgive people in traffic, It's like, so I was like, wow, it just felt like impossible. But it is possible to, move into more difficult places. But the reason I brought that up is because when I was studying Lojong, my teacher would always say, don't attempt this at home. Because that's where it's the hardest to work. He said, do this in the grocery store, do this in the office, but allow yourself to be an absolute failure once you get home. Like just, because you can feel like, especially if you really decide to devote yourself to spiritual practice, and then you're just in the same old bickering that you've always been in. You're like, oh my God, am I like just a failure in life, And it's just like, let yourself fail at home.
It's a distraction.
It's just, it's too hot. The fire's too hot, my teacher used to always say. You're going to be screwed. There's no way around it.
You say, though, that if you can find a corner of your
Yeah, of course, yeah.
spot,
Mm-hmm.
and always associate that spot with exactly that kind of piece,
Yeah.
you have a better chance
Yeah, and
of
so,
doing that. It isn't the entire house.
yeah.
It could be a room, it could be a corner,
Yeah.
and something to focus.
Yeah, and so now what Harry's bringing up is how to develop a home practice. So when I say forget about the home, what I mean is forget about trying to do any of these practices in the middle of an argument with your husband or when your kids are driving you crazy. That's what I mean. But now you can absolutely practice in your home. And a couple quick points, and we'll take a break in a second. I just want to bring up two things before we break. One is how to develop it. Like if you decide, I want to learn this skill of meditation in a more serious way. Unfortunately, the key is daily practice. I suggest a minimum of 6 days a week. So you take one day off. And then, so I used to teach music, and I would tell my students, please practice every day. And of course, after a lesson, they're all excited. I'm totally going to practice every day. And then the next week is like, how did it go? They were like, well, I practiced 2 hours right before the lesson. But that was it, So I'm always thinking, how can I get people to practice, So I was like, forget an hour a day. Let's do 30 minutes a day. Totally, I'm going to do 30 minutes a day, Same thing. I practiced an hour before the lesson. But I didn't get to it this week. And I heard it from enough people that I knew it wasn't just the circumstances of that week. You see what I mean? And then, so then I was like, all right, practice 5 minutes a day. And nobody did it. Right? And then something interesting happened. I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to set a timer, and I want you to just play your instrument for 3 minutes a day, minimum. You can do more if you want, but a minimum 3 minutes a day. And suddenly people started to do it. And here's what I think. 5 minutes a day we think of as technically a chunk of time. Like it's a chunk, We have like 5 minutes. Do you have 5 minutes, And most of us don't have 5 minutes, or we don't have 5 minutes to sit still. But 3 minutes you can't get away from. Like everybody's got 3 minutes. You see, it's like this time thing. So at the beginning of practice, you can't do a lot. I mean, to be honest, you can't do a lot with 3 minutes, but what you can do is develop a habit. And that's at the beginning stages, that's the most important thing. So once I moved to 3 minutes a day, both in meditation students and music students, I noticed people do it. Because here's what you do. You lay down, at the end of the day, you're exhausted. You're so excited for bed. And then you're like, oh no, I forgot to meditate. If it was 5 minutes, you'd say, I'll do it tomorrow. But 3 minutes, you literally get up, sit on your pillow and sit for 3 minutes. And you'll sleep better anyway, right? So you'll have made up that 3 minutes. And I've done that. When I'm really busy and I forget to meditate, I'm like, oh my God, I'll sit for 3 minutes right now. And if you want to sit for 5 after the 3 minutes, fine, but that's it. So I would recommend to you, if you're like, I would like to give this a try, I recommend this. I recommend commit to 3 minutes a day, 6 days a week for 40 days. And then reevaluate and see where you're at. Yeah, Cecily.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, I was thinking, that's how we set the habit.
Yeah, totally.
We begin with 3 minutes a day, but it's so much more than the 3 minutes, it's setting the habit.
Exactly.
And another thing I make really good use of for myself when I'm more frantic than I want to be is I use Post-its and stick them on the
Totally.
kitchen cabinet and
Yeah.
then say, stop.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm walking through the kitchen on my way to put something away or something, and I see the Post-it thing that says stop, and I stop and I stand.
Yeah, great.
And it's amazing. That's so easy. And you don't have to stand for long, but what it does is kind of set the habit
Yeah.
of coming back to yourself in such an easy way.
Yeah, great, thank you. And yeah, like what Harry was talking about too, find a place in your home that, I have one student who sits in his toilet, and that's where he does his practice, because it's the one place nobody will bother him. And he puts the toilet seat down. I have another friend who does that in the office. He does his meditation after he gets to the office, and he does it in the bathroom. And again, just figure out what works for you. I know somebody else that does it in their car in the parking lot of their office building. So you just find what works for you. But
Warm shower.
yeah, yeah,
There's something about water.
totally, yeah, yeah.
Releases it.
Yeah, warm shower. Yeah, just, and here's the thing, make it your own and let it be playful a little bit, like explore. So I was teaching meditation. I've been teaching for a long time, and I was working with one particular student, very bright man, and he knew all the stages, he knew the techniques, he knew the data, but he wasn't progressing in the way that I thought he should be. I was perplexed. So I was just constantly thinking, what is going on here? Like, where's the block? And then all of a sudden, something so obvious occurred to me, which is that meditation is an intimacy practice. We're trying to become intimate with the present moment. Now, I know like Harry's a psychologist, and probably some of you are, and most of us have probably been in therapy or been on the other side of therapy. When somebody comes into a therapist's office, there's two movements that are simultaneously happening. I want to grow, and I also want to armor myself from growth. You see those two contradictory things. I want intimacy, and I also want to block any intimacy. And it suddenly occurred to me that exact same thing is happening in meditation. So here's the process I went through. I started realizing most of us, on one level, are sabotaging our meditation. But here's the problem with the word sabotage. If I were to say, Judy, you're sabotaging yourself. You're self-sabotaging. What's the quality of that?
Negative.
Yeah, it's a negative. And I realized, how can I talk about this in a way that's not negative? Because it's not a negative thing. So I finally, and you might think of something better, but I finally realized it's an armoring. See, armoring has less of a positive negative connotation. So yeah, I'm armoring myself. Guess what? That armoring has also kept you safe. It's kept you functioning in this difficult world. So there's no problem for the armoring. So, but as soon as you become aware that that's actually happening also, it becomes very helpful. Because what I realized with this man, I was like, he doesn't need any more techniques and he doesn't need to meditate more. He needs to drop the armoring. So now what I do, I teach these meditation trainings, usually like 9-month trainings. And the very first thing we do, we don't even start meditating. All we do is look for our 5 most common defense mechanisms. So just to become aware when they're popping up, because they will pop up in your meditation. Let me give you an example. I was in a fight with my girlfriend one time. I was wide awake, I was feeling fine, I was feeling energized, and we suddenly got into a fight, and I could not keep my eyes open. I was just fading, right? That didn't go over very well with her. Because she's interpreting that as like, you care so little about this relationship, you want to go to sleep right now? But what was happening is I was in a self-defense mechanism. I was an armoring, unconscious armoring, where I was falling asleep because it was so painful. And I had no idea that was happening. I'm like, why am I sound asleep like right now? I cannot stay awake. And the minute the fight ended, I was awake. I was like, I don't need a nap, so I was like, what is that? So that's one of my personal, I've discovered 5 of my most common defense mechanisms. And I know that's one of them. Guess what happens when I get into meditation and I'm starting to become intimate? All right? So now there is a type of sleepiness that's unrelated to that comes up in meditation, which is called dullness, and we'll talk about that, and that's just, we have to conquer that. But there is a type of sleepiness that's just a defense mechanism, So again, find those defense mechanisms, those ways that you typically armor yourself, and I recommend write them down, literally write them down. They'll always come in one of 2 varieties: a desire to control or avoid. That's, if we look at all the different defense mechanisms, they kind of fall in one of those 2 categories: a desire to control things or a desire to avoid things. And there's some, obviously, permeations between those 2. All right, real quickly, before we take a break, there's something I think that can be really helpful to talk about at this point. Which is, there's 2 ways that the mind is working all the time, and one is called attention, and the other is awareness. So if you notice on your handout, there's a triangle under mindfulness. And this is the technical definition of mindfulness that we're just going to touch on before the break. This chart particularly comes from a wonderful meditation teacher named Shinzen Young. And he's also a mathematician, so he's always writing formulas for meditation. And so here's a proper, when we think of mindfulness, it's a very pop word now, everyone's like, be mindful and mindfulness and this. What actually are we talking about? What is mindfulness? Mindfulness has 3 distinct components. The first one, which I don't want to talk a lot about right now, is equanimity. Right top now is equanimity. The Greek for equanimity is apatheia. And what word do we get from that? Apathy. And it's so funny because apathy has such apathy is not a good thing, and it's not what equanimity means. But Harry and I were just talking. I just found, I love New York bookstores, and I found this amazing book that I had to buy. That's the problem with traveling with luggage. My luggage gets heavier and heavier. I've already bought 3 books on this trip. But I bought this beautiful 5th century Greek Christian scholar whose name I'm forgetting now. And the whole book is about apatheia as being the most essential part of prayer. And what he's talking about is he's talking about what in Buddhism is known as equanimity. So equanimity is not apathy. Equanimity is an ability to be present with whatever's arising without needing to push it away or grab onto it. But that we're not going to talk about much, but yeah.
So is the idea to not disturb?
The idea is to, we could say that, but here's another way of thinking about equanimity. Can you be okay with not being okay? You see? It's a little deeper than just trying to be okay with what's happening. You see, no, and feel the difference. Like, hey, just be okay with what's happening. Yeah. And then the next level, so that's one level, but the deeper level is, can you be okay with not being okay? You're like, I'm not okay right now. And there's a way that you can be spacious around not being okay right now, as opposed to this more new age Oprah Winfrey style of like, just be okay with whatever's arising. And I'm like, screw you, I'm not okay with what's arising. And that's the deeper level of equanimity. Okay, can you not be okay with what's being okay? Can you be okay with not being okay? It's a little bit of a kind of a mind twist, but.
It's a great teacher of that. Physical pain.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Break a bone or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Like nothing teaches you to calm down, wearing a cast for 6 weeks.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know that?
Yeah.
It'll teach you to calm down.
Yeah, and you're like, okay. So that's equanimity. Now, the other two is what I really want to focus on. And attention and awareness. Which one do you think is attention? Yeah, this one, right? Now what's the difference between attention and awareness? Yeah, attention is more focused concentration. Yeah, there can be a purpose behind awareness, but yeah, it's usually focused, right? So if you notice on your handout, it says number of objects, right? Awareness has many objects. If I say, hey, be aware, right? You're just aware, what do I need to be aware of? Like, hey, be really aware tonight, right? It'd be like you're opening up your mind to many objects. If I said, hey, pay attention, you'd be like, to what? Right? So attention usually has one object, and awareness has many objects.
And aren't you kind of in neutral?
Yeah, I mean, you're not, yeah, because as soon as you move out of neutral, you're usually paying attention. Awareness is just open. Now, the other one is the mental processing that's involved. So awareness, the mental process, it's a minimal mental processing, right? It's less actual mental energy that's being taken up. And attention, you're having a greater levels of mental processing. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So I happened to, where I did my 3-year retreat, there were a lot of rattlesnakes and a lot of bears. So when I would walk around my retreat cabin, I had to pay attention to, and I don't know if anybody's come up to a rattlesnake in the woods, but they blend in. I mean, it's amazing. And even in the desert, when there's nothing around, I've almost stepped on rattlesnakes. I was walking one time, and I just like, I was walking, and I just kind of stopped for a little while, and I was just looking at the environment. And then I looked down, and as close as Phyllis's foot, there was a curled up rattlesnake that I didn't see when I stopped. And he was just sleeping with one eye on me. He was like, what is this guy doing? And then I just walked away. But so they really blend in. So you have to pay attention. That's a lot of mental energy, and it's a focus. But every now and then I have to lift up my head and scan for bears. Right? Because it was like, okay, are there any bears? And then back to attention. And that's the exact movement we're trying to do in our meditation. Right? We're not trying to stay totally focused. What we're trying to do is build mindfulness, which is an optimal balance between attention and awareness imbued with equanimity. That's the technical definition of mindfulness. An optimal balance between attention and awareness imbued with equanimity. Relaxed, taking a walk, and looking for snakes and being aware of bears. An optimal balance between attention and awareness.
Sounds like an unnerving experience.
Imbued with equanimity. Yeah, it's like you're just trying to take a walk, and it's like, oh my God. So here's what it means. When you're trying to receive the sensation of the breath, you're also opening up your peripheral awareness. Stages 1 through 4, and I know we're gonna get into the stages after the break. So we haven't talked about it yet, but stages 1 through 4, you're not shutting down peripheral awareness. And again, this is why cell phones can be so helpful, why vacuuming in the hallway can be so helpful, because that keeps our peripheral awareness awake, keeps it alert. Like, oh, don't fall asleep. Because what happens is when the peripheral awareness collapses, we have what's called a collapse of awareness, and then very quickly what happens is sleepiness, dullness, and we fade out, right? Because we've had a collapse of awareness. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . So any questions about that so far? Yeah.
Even the word attention,
Yeah.
like it costs us something.
Yeah,
like the
right,
energy
yeah.
behind it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's two main kind of arch enemies in meditation. You know, it's a wrong way to say it, but two main things that we're going to be dealing with, and we're going to talk about this after the break. But one is dullness, and one is agitation. Agitation's that part of the mind that wants to come up with ideas, that is thinking about what you have to do. You know, just that kind of, they call it the monkey mind, right? And dullness is just like, you know, dullness is just that very settled. But here's the tricky thing with dullness. Dullness, when it's not sleep, when it's just a subtle level of dullness, feels very spiritual. It feels good. And I have an older woman that I've been working with. She's in her 80s. She's been meditating her whole life, and she got habituated to dullness. And she came to me. She says, "I want to get out of dullness in the next 10 years." Like, that was her goal, you know. And the problem is, what had happened is she had habituated the mind to thinking dullness was, because dullness feels wonderful. It feels great. And it can feel spiritual because the mind's relaxing, you're just dull. I almost wanted to suggest this last night, because a great way of finding dullness is, well, one is eating lasagna. If you want to be like, what does dullness feel like? How can I, have a slice of lasagna? But a better way is forget the lasagna. Sit down someday. For those of you that drink, sit down and just have no alcohol in you, and just notice for a moment, 3 or 4 minutes, the state of the mind. And then have a glass of wine pretty quickly, and then notice dullness come onto the mind. Because alcohol, what it does, the reason it's so pleasurable is it dulls the mind. And that's exactly what we're fighting against in meditation. My teacher tricked me into taking no drinking vows. I didn't have a problem with drinking, but I liked a glass of wine every now and then and just dull the senses, right? It's pleasurable. And he said to me one day, he said, "Oh, we're going to be doing vows today. You should do that." I was like, "Sure, I'll take some vows." Like, "What are they?" He's like, "No, they're not a big deal, you know." And then turned out I had taken 263 vows that radically changed my life. The trick wasn't that severe, but he actually told me before I took them. But that was the one. I was like, "Don't make me like give up drinking," you know. And now it's so helpful, because I realize it's tricky to deepen in meditation. Now, but anyway, so that's a very helpful way to start to figure out what dullness feels like. Because people think it's like a bad thing, so it should feel bad. No, it feels wonderful. And it can feel like, I've had experiences with a glass of wine where my heart opens, and I just feel like, I feel love, and I feel, so that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. I'm just saying it is a type of dullness as well. And dullness can lead to an opening of the heart. It can have very spiritual type feelings. But in terms of developing stability of attention, it can be very challenging. Yeah.
How did the woman know she was stuck in dullness? It was pleasant, and she felt like she was having a spiritual experience.
So we would sit together. We'd do these half-day group sits at the monastery, at the lavender farm, and every now and then I'll say, pause. We'll be in an hour-long sit maybe, and I'll say, "Okay, everyone just pause." And what I'm doing at that point is I'm preventing a collapse of awareness. Because your awareness will go like this, and you'll go into a dullness. And when I say pause, it's like, it can be startling. And she came up to me and she says, "It's so frustrating when you pause, because I'm in this wonderful state." And so I just pointed out, that's dullness, So she started started reading some of the scripture about working with subtle and gross dullness, and she realized, I've been in dullness for most of my life. But one way to know you're in dullness is when you're startled in meditation. Again, because in meditation we're not trying to go anywhere, we're trying to become present. I was sitting with my teacher, and he's passed away now, but we used to do these epic long meditations that were a challenge for me, but they were fine for him. But I remember one time we were about maybe 2 hours and 50 minutes into a meditation. And the room was very still, and he was just a very deep meditator. And somebody came to the door, right? And he was like, somebody like knocked on the door, and he just stood up, and he answered, "Hey, how you doing?" "Okay, yeah, we'll just finish up here, you know." And meanwhile, I'm like, somebody knocked on the door, I was like, whoa, where am I? You know, it's just like, whoa. And he had not gone anywhere, you see what I mean? He was so profoundly present that for him it wasn't an interruption because he didn't have a collapse of peripheral awareness. So what dullness is it's a collapse of awareness into attention. And notice what happens when we go to sleep. When we go to sleep, we move into an area called hypnagogia. And hypnagogia is just a fancy word for when the mind starts to go like, you know, it's like, and you start to have nonsensical thoughts. Anybody notice that as you're falling asleep? And what's actually happening is awareness is collapsing in. And then we get to this point and then we fall asleep, right? And then we hear a loud sound and suddenly the awareness opens up again and we're awake. And then it collapses again. I remember I one time fell asleep at the wheel on a major interstate. I was 18 hitchhiking across country and I got picked up by this guy and he's like, "We're gonna drive all night." I was like, "Okay." He's like, "We're gonna switch off driving." And I was 18. But I remember that moment of driving. And you just have this little thought that's like, "Hey, it's okay to just close your eyes for a second," you know? And that's hypnagogic. That's a collapse of awareness. When things start to make sense that shouldn't make sense, and you're like, "Oh," you know, we were fine because I was going 15 miles an hour. The highway was empty, and I was just like putting along, thinking I was going 60, but I was going 15. And then we drove off the road, and he woke up. He's like, "Oh, is it time to switch driving?" I was like, "Yeah." But he never knew I fell asleep. But that's, you know, so notice just this contraction and expansion. And she was able, once she finally realized that was happening, the only thing she had to do was just become more and more aware of it. And that's the beauty of so many of these practices. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to figure anything out. You don't have to use techniques. It's just awareness, gentle awareness. Oh, that's dullness. And then things correct themselves, you know. So let's take a little break. And we'll take another break too. That's not your only break. I know I have a much easier job. It's much harder to sit and listen than it is to talk. So thank you for enduring. It is, I will say, this is a lot easier than hanging out with the Tibetans. So typically, when I would sit with my lamas, we might start a class, and I'm not exaggerating, we might start a class at 4 in the afternoon, and we might go to 2 in the morning with no break. And I said to one of my teachers once, I said, "You know what, I've got to go to the bathroom." He's like, "Hold it." You know, it's like, now as a middle-aged man, that would be impossible. So it'd be like, but no, I've endured such incredible long classes, and I did find that endurance was fruitful in a way. I'm not going to torture you, but I just want to say this is not as bad as it could be. So what I want to do is now I want to start touching on, if you notice you have a chart in your reading, you can pull that out. We're going to skip around a little bit. The stages of meditation. This chart comes from...
Need our glasses.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, and we'll read that Tibetan out loud. If somebody would start for us, please. No, we're not going to go. We're not going to go through this. This is a week-long course to really go through all of this. But I just wanted to give you a taste of how it's articulated. But this chart, this particular chart, was drawn by Kebje Trijang Rinpoche, who was one of the tutors of the present Dalai Lama. And Trijong Rinpoche is just considered one of the, imagine if you're going to have a tutor for the head of the state, it's going to be one of the smartest people and the most accomplished people. And Trijong Rinpoche was really wonderful. But all he did was draw the chart, but the original chart was drawn and described by a wonderful man named Kamalashila, who comes from the 4th century, his dates are 740 to 795 AD. And there's roughly 2 branches, a quick, not that you signed up for this, but a quick introduction to Buddhism. There's roughly 2 branches. The Buddha, and we see the same thing in Christianity, right? You see the charismatic leader of the religion, right? Like Jesus or Buddha, who were neither Buddhist nor Christian, right? I mean, Jesus wasn't Christian, the Buddha wasn't Buddhist, but they are just reformers in a way. Then when their passing happens, the students get together and try to figure out what was the message, right? And then you have all the different councils. I just spent a couple of weeks learning about all the different councils of the Christian church and what each one of them decided against and for. And the most famous one in the Episcopal world, right, is the Nicene Council, right? But it's like, okay, we decide that now this is the teaching of Jesus, So the same thing happened in Buddhism. There you had 10 different councils. And eventually what happened is the church, the Buddhist world split into 2, what you could roughly call those who adopted the Pali canon, and Pali is a language, so all the scriptures that were written in Pali, and those that adopted the Sanskrit canon, all the scriptures written in Sanskrit. So there's 2 branches, which are roughly called Mahayana and Theravada now. Some examples of Mahayana path, which is mostly what I've been trained in, are like Zen, Tibetan Buddhism. So those are, kind of some of the impetuses of that canon. And in the Pali canon, you have countries like Burma, what's oftentimes called Vipassana, and different branches of that. Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg comes out of that Pali canon. Pema Chodron comes out of the Mahayana canon. So that just to say that this is coming out of the Mahayana canon. From Kamalashila is kind of the grandfather of all meditation in the Mahayana canon. So this is a chart, and it is very accurate. And it's a progression, what's called a stage-based approach, like I mentioned last night, on how meditation unfolds. Stage 1, stage 2, what you need to know for each different stage. Now here's the problem, and really listen up because this is super important. It turns out meditation doesn't unfold that way.
What a surprise.
Yeah, it turns out it's not a linear progression. So the stage-based approach is very helpful because everybody in here can identify what stage you're at, and depending on what stage you're at, that's what you should be working on. The problem is, if you think stage 2 leads to stage 3, you're going to be frustrated. Because stage 2 might lead to stage 8, and stage 8 might lead to stage 2. Okay, so you all know that game, Chutes and Ladders? That game is an Indian game, and this is the true history of that game. That game was designed to emulate the spiritual path. That game, like Parcheesi, they both come out of India, but particularly Chutes and Ladders was designed to emulate the spiritual path. And so we are talking about a stage-based approach, but it's going to look a lot more like Chutes and Ladders. And if you forget the game, you climb up the ladder, and then you hit the slide, and you go all the way back down to 1. So don't get frustrated. Awakening doesn't happen in this linear way, but it is helpful to understand it as a linear process. Okay, did I lose anybody there? Okay, because that's important. The type A personalities among us will be like, awesome, what do I have to do to get to stage 3, And they're going to be very frustrated. There's this old Zen story, I'm sure you've heard it, but this kid comes up to a Zen master and he says, I feel very, very dedicated to becoming enlightened. How long will it take? And the Zen master says, if you're really that dedicated, it'll take 2 or 3 years. And he says, what about if I devote everything to that totally single focus? And he says, no, it'll take about 70 years. And again, it's any attempt to create a non-agitated state of mind is itself an agitated state of mind. So it's this funny thing of like, the more we try, the further away we get. You can't force yourself into learning to refine relinquishment. But here's the hopeful thing, I think, for us, and I want to touch on this from a couple different angles. What that does mean is as we get older and more mature and more wise, we are more in tune with progressing on the spiritual path. In other words, for God's sake, we at least have one advantage over 20-year-olds, right? Is that we just have some more skills in developing and maturing on the path, which is that ability to refine relinquishment, which is surrender, right? And risking vulnerability. Both of those skills are needed to progress along the path. So roughly, let's look at stages 1 through 4. So I'll just tell you a couple of symbolisms here. So it's really hard to see, but kind of in the bottom left-hand corner of the first curve on the path, you see a big flame. I don't know if you can see that in this difficult Xerox, but there's a little flame coming off the bottom of the first bend, a flame like a fire.
Is this our number 7?
Yes, I think that is a number 7. I don't have my glasses. Yeah, exactly, right at the number 7 there. You can notice every turn has a flame associated with it. If you follow up the path, you notice there's flames all the way. What does the flame represent? The flame represents the amount of effort that stage takes. Guess what takes the most? Stage 1. It is the hardest thing on this whole path to awakening. The hardest thing is to develop a daily habit. So if you don't have a daily habit of practice, there's good and bad news. You are at the hardest point of the journey. If you do have a daily practice, you are now kind of going downhill. Not quite. I mean, it's going to be easier and easier. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot of effort that's needed, but the most effort is developing a daily practice.
You got to show up.
You got to show up.
Whether you feel like it or not, you got to show up.
Yeah, and you guys with Cecily and with Harry, you have wonderful opportunities in this community to be together, to sit together. And really, what I was saying yesterday, Thich Nhat Hanh was saying that community is the new guru. I mean, being together is so helpful. And also as a side point, I am so grateful to Trinity and to Mark and to everybody having me because by me teaching, it keeps me in the marketplace, keeps me on the path. When I don't feel like meditating, I was like, I don't want to dip to that level of hypocrisy because I'm about to teach meditation. So I use you all to keep me progressed on the path. So I'm just so grateful. I could do this stuff if I was all alone and just talk to myself, but it really helps to have people here. So thank you for coming and being a part of that. But really, it's being together that helps push us on the path. So the first stage is really developing a practice. So at stage 1, what do you need to focus on? Stage 1, what you really need to focus on is daily dedication. And again, I think that this technique is very helpful. 3 minutes a day, 6 days a week for 40 days. Just do it. Just go for it. And then decide after 40 days, see if you want to do that again or see if you want to increase the number of minutes. One way to increase the minutes after 40 days is add a minute a week for the rest of your life. And then it'll be very interesting. You just suddenly increase in your capacity. I recently met a person who says they have not missed a day of meditation in 65 years. And he does 2 hours, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening, and he hasn't missed a single one of those. I was astounded. I was like, that is not me, I've done some 3-minute meditations over the years, but
Must not have kids.
yeah, totally. I think so. A quick side point about that, a wonderful book, if you want to read a book, is called The Life of Dipa Ma, D-I-P-A-M-A. This is a very poor single mother who sits hours a day. A working single mother who sits hours a day. She is the main teacher of Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg, and she is she's passed away now, but she is a phenomenal human being. And she totally dismisses this idea of not having time to meditate. She tells Jack Kornfield one time, she says, Jack, don't be lazy. Why don't you do a 3-day sit? And he's like, what, you mean like sit for three days, like days? She's like, no, sit in one meditation for 3 days. Like, what would that be? 48 plus 24, 72 hours. Do one 72-hour sit. And he's like, you're insane. You know, he didn't do it. But she's the kind of person that can actually do that, which is a level that's astounding, you know. And she says, oh, you're just being lazy, Jack. But so anyway, that's a wonderful book. And when I read that book, I'm like, whew, I got to up my game a little bit. She was hardcore, like, stop complaining, go sit, you know. And that can be helpful sometimes. So stage 1, develop a daily practice. The other interesting thing, which I really want to focus on at the end of class, is, you can write this down if you want, is de-reify. It's a fancy word. I wrote the word for you on your handout. Page 1. You can see reification. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But stage 1, what you want to work on is de-reifying the object of meditation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So stage 1, you're working on de-reifying the object.
What is de-reify?
I know, we're going to talk about it in a minute. So I'm telling you before I explain it.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a Tibetan technique, you know, for better or for worse. In the Tibetan monasteries, you memorize, and I'm giving you a metaphor of how the Tibetan education system works. You would memorize, let's say, a calculus textbook, literally memorize it, so you can, and you just recite it out loud. It wouldn't really be that. It'd be like logic, you know, 203 or something. And when you're a little kid, so by the time you get to, you know, age 18 and you're actually studying that, you've already memorized the text. So as a kid, you memorize it having no idea what it means. And that's just the way the Tibetans do their education system. So you memorize this stuff. You have no, you know, as a kid, you have no idea what it means. And then suddenly you're 18 and you're like in calculus, and they're teaching it to you. You've already memorized the whole text. It's really interesting, and it's just a different way. So sometimes my teachers would tell me stuff, and they'll say, we'll explain that in 3 years, but just memorize it. So I'm kind of doing that with you right now. We'll talk about reification in a minute. Now here's what are the lines here? Imagine that, let's see, imagine that my thermos is when my mind is on the object. And for simplicity's sake, let me say the object being the breath, right? So here's when I'm on the breath, and then my phone is when I'm off the breath, okay? So my phone is thinking about, I'm obsessed personally with interior design. So in 3-year retreat, that's where my mind would go. I would be like meditating, thinking, you know, being in my object of meditation, and then all of a sudden I'm like in a friend's kitchen. I'm like, if they just took out that wall, it would really open up that space and move that sink, you know. So that's where my mind would wander, either shark attacks or interior design, okay? So this is the mind on the breath, and this is like shark attacks or interior design. So stage 1 is the line means I'm on the breath. So most of that time I'm off the breath, right? So off, oh, remember the breath, you know, like that. So that's kind of stage 1. Stage 2, notice there's some longer periods where you're on the object, right? Some sustension, and then like, okay, on it again a little bit, off for a while, and then you might be on again for a little while. And then stage 3, you have what's called patching, where you're patching together moments of awareness of the breath. So now here I'm on the breath for a bit, and then, oops, there we go, shark attacks, you know, and then back on the breath, you know, and then, okay, curtain colors, you know, and back, you know, so it's like that. So you can see that's just a simple progression of how we move. So how do you find where you are? Really, it's a percentage thing. Are you off the breath more than on the breath? Or off the meditation object more than on? No problem. You're working at stage 1 that day, or that week, or that month, or that year. Are you off the breath more than on, but you have occasional moments where you can stay with the object of meditation for a minute or 2 minutes without losing it? Great, then you're at level 2. Are you on the breath, more on the object? And again, I'm saying breath synonymously with object. It might not, you might be doing mantras or you might be doing visualizations. So I'm just saying breath, but really what I mean is whatever object of meditation you've chosen. Are you on the object of meditation more than off, but you still get lost in mind wandering sometime? Great, you're at stage 3, okay? Now, stage 4 is a different type of practice, because stage 4, for the first time in our lives, we now do no longer lose the object of meditation. Now, we might lose clarity of the object, but we no longer fully lose it. So now at stage 4, we're working with some new skills, and those skills are starting to work with what's called gross dullness and gross agitation. Okay, so and I mostly just wanted to talk about stage 1 through 4. So let's back up. So I talked about what to work on with stage 1, right? What were they? Quick quiz, pop quiz. Yeah, so that's one technique. And what else are we working on with stage 1? What are the daily dedication? Yeah, daily dedication. And what's the other thing we haven't talked about yet? Dereifying the object of meditation. Okay. So those are what we're working on. Stage 2, what are we working on? We're working on increasing clarity of the object. Okay, just trying to increase the clarity that we're making that the object is. Notice you can have an idea of the breath, but it's really fuzzy. You're like, oh yeah, there's the inhale, there's the exhale. But it's very different when you come into real contact with all of the detail of the breath. So we're increasing clarity. And then what we're also doing at stage 2 is now we're working on the muscle of returning to the object with diligence. What do I mean by that? I'll be meditating and I'll be with the breath, and all of a sudden I move to interior design and I'm like redesigning my mom's kitchen, right? Or my mom's bathroom. This happened one time. And suddenly I have that awakening. I rejoice, fantastic. It feels so nice to wake up. I'm supposed to be meditating. I'm working on my parents' bathroom, redesigning it. So I was like, okay, so that waking up, I appreciate that. And then can I return directly to the object? But here's what happens sometimes. We're thinking like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be meditating. Okay, I'll go right back to the object. Just let me finish one little thing in my mind, in my fantasy. Let me just rip up the carpet and see what it would look like with, some sectional carpets, And there's just, the mind is really reluctant to let go of its fantasies, negative or positive, revenge fantasies. You're like, I'll come right back to the object of meditation, but let me just finish this little fantasy. That's what I mean. At stage 2, you now have to drop the object. You have to be very dedicated and just really say, okay, now I need to work on a new level of practice. Level 1, you don't have to worry about that. It's not important. You just forget about it. But level 2, you're like, okay, drop the object. One of my teachers told me, and this was so important, so helpful for me, he said it's like telling a dog to drop the ball, and you just have to be very forceful. Drop it, like that kind of like, ugh. And I had to do that with myself. Will, drop it right now. He's like, I will, but just no, drop it, So that's what we're working on stage 2. Stage 3, we're working on, and this one it becomes very difficult because we're working on resisting indulging in dullness. And again, I talked about this before the break. Dullness feels pleasurable, and we really have to resist the indulgence in that. The way that I really work through this stage is realizing that I couldn't be of help to anybody in this world if I didn't get through this stage. So I had to use other people. I was like, oh, I want to be a light in this world. I want to create clarity. Drop it for nobody's sake, but for somebody else's. They did a experiment. I read about this once, and they put up in the bathrooms of hospitals, they put up a sign and says, washing your hands prevents you from getting sickness. And then what they did was they measured the amount of people walking in and out of the bathroom, the amount of paper towels used, and they measured the amount of water use. Right? So in other words, they were seeing how many people washed their hands. And then they changed the sign, and they said, washing your hands prevents others from getting diseases. And we wash our hands more often when we're reminded that it's helping others. So that's all I mean at this stage, is what I had to do is remind myself, this is not just about you, this is about creating clarity in the world, And that's how I resisted indulging in dullness. Because again, dullness feels wonderful, and it's a very hard stage to get over. Now, there is a type of dullness where you're just exhausted. And I remember I went to one of my lamas and I said, I keep falling asleep in meditation. How do I work with that? And he said, go take a nap. He said, go to sleep. He said, sleep in, like for God's sake, get enough sleep, So there is one thing that we're just also exhausted. And I do find most of us are exhausted, emotionally, physically. So get enough sleep. Figure out I've designed my life around my practice as opposed to the other way around. So I personally am the sharpest after my afternoon nap. I take like a 5-minute afternoon nap, and then that's when I do my longest meditation. So, figure out when you're sharpest, and then use that for your practice. We do a morning and an evening practice as well, but that's just to keep us kind of grounded. So usually I sit 3 times a day. The morning and evening are very short, just 5-10-minute sits in the little community that we have. And then my afternoon practice will be my real practice. And then number 4, let's see. Oh, and then the other thing with number 3, the other thing we're really working on is what we talked about last night, is appreciating that awakening moment. Really appreciating awakening. Which means not beating yourself up for mind wandering. Right? And that's a very, very amazing thing to overcome. How do you know you've overcome this? Okay, and again, I'm not exaggerating. This is literally what I mean. Let's say you do a 1-hour sit. Let's say you're spaced out heavily for 59 minutes of that sit. You have one little moment of waking up. Let's say even 20 seconds. You're like, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating. And then you go right back into mind wandering. If you can get up from that sit feeling like you just had a very successful meditation, you've accomplished that switching from self-recrimination to appreciating your effort. And I propose that is accurate. You just had a very successful meditation. Why? Because you did it and you had an awakening moment in that meditation. Now, for years, if somebody said, how was your meditation? I've been like, it sucked again, It's like this energy. It's like, ugh, right? But as soon as I made that switch, and if somebody were to ask me, how was your meditation? And I was spaced out for 59 minutes, I'd be like, it was incredible. I had an awakening experience. It was great. So it's just like, it's the upliftment, right? It's the shoulders back, it's the heart open. It's just like, right? In yoga class, there's no instruction of like curl your shoulders in, protect your heart, and just notice how it is in your body when you get up from the sit. You feel like, oh, that was beautiful. Plenty of room for improvement, but I really did a great job by risking intimacy and sitting down with my practice. Does that make sense? So that's really what we're working on at stage 3. Yeah, Mary.
I don't want to, anyway, I
No.
just wonder, because I have times like that where I'm just spaced out.
Totally.
But it's still helpful somehow, there's more spaciousness afterwards. I guess my question is there any use, is there something that's helpful even in being spaced out in your meditation?
Right. So and again, this is how I was able to work through this stage, because I had the same thought. I was like, well, I do feel more relaxed. and I feel like more at ease. I simply separated out meditative practices from meditation. So I did, and what I did was I actually increased my meditative practices. And sometimes my meditative practices, if you were to look at me from the outside, it might look like I'm doing the exact same thing. I might be sitting in meditation, but in my mind, I'm doing a meditative practice, which is I'm just relaxing. I might even be spacing out. I might be just doing some light visualization, and I'm not working on anything. The analogy is like if I'm trying to learn piano, sometimes I might be working on scales, and other times I might just be playing what I already know because it's joyful to do something you're already good at. When I'm doing something I'm already good at, I'm not increasing my skill very much, a little bit maybe, but I'm just kind of moving in the rut that the patterns that I'm already good at. The key thing, and again, this is one of my teachers told me, separate those two out and don't confuse them at all. And I can't stress this enough. If you want to train in meditation, you have to do the training, which means you go in with a very clear intention that you're going to try to increase your capacity. And again, how do you increase capacity? By letting go of effort. Now here's the thing, and this is a subtle point, is that you'll notice that mind wandering, when you let go of mind wandering, it's a releasing. So mind wandering takes a very subtle type of effort. It's a grasping. One second. So oftentimes when we're mind wandering, we think it's like we're moving from effort to like, oh, relax and mind wandering. But really what's happening is the opposite. When we mind wander, it's actually a kind of grasping. And you'll notice when you have that awakening of I'm supposed to be meditating, and then you go back into clarity, it's a ah. So I'm talking about like training, but again, the training is releasing. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, what we can say.
Just thinking, when I came to meditation, it was through mindfulness, it was through wellness. And it's branded as wellness. Branded, I think, my interpretation as a meditation.
Exactly.
Not as meditation. So I have spent many, many years learning myself on apps and things like that. What I shouldn't, that it should be skill building.
Yeah.
I just wish that it wasn't branded as wellness.
Yeah, and that's, and I think that, exactly, and that's been my experience too, is that have you noticed that our culture kind of tends to take the sacred and just make it so vanilla that it just loses some of the depth to it. It's just a way that we take sacred practices and we just make them more, we just lose some of the depth. And so I think a lot of the really profundity of meditation is lost because it's been branded as just well-being. And again, I think people, in my experience, very few people are actually interested in the training. Now here's the other thing, and this is really important for us to remember, is that you do not need to be a meditator to have a fulfilling, meaningful spiritual life. You do not need to be a meditator to have awakening experiences. We overestimate the benefits of meditation in this culture. I can't tell you how many people come to me and like, if only I could learn to meditate, then everything will be okay. And I'm proof that it's not. I remember I was studying yoga with this wonderful teacher, Richard Freeman, and we were doing Paschimottanasana, forward fold, And he's like completely flat on his legs, folding forward, and I'm like, like this, right? And he looks up to me and he says, I've been to the feet and I can report that there's nothing to report. Because it's this idea, as soon as I get to the feet, then everything will work out, right? And it's not true. Meditation is not a golden bullet. It's not a golden pill. It's not gonna solve all your problems. So as soon as we stop exaggerating meditation, we can then really engage it in a more joyful way. So if you're not prone to be a meditator, you're fine. One of my teachers says, and it's such a great statement, he says, awakening is an accident, and all meditation does is make you more accident prone. It just helps assist you. but you can have awakenings without that. So just in line with that, we don't have to see like I wasted my life, and those meditative practices are helpful. But I have seen again and again and again when people separate those out, then they progress in a very different way. Yeah, it's just.
I'm fascinated holding a magnifying glass.
Yeah.
To meditation. I've
Yeah.
never heard that done before or thought about it.
Yeah.
And I hear Baba Muktananda, the City Yoga Path, in my
Totally.
ear saying, there is no bad meditation.
Yeah.
There's only meditation.
Yeah.
Give up all ideas of improving.
Yeah.
And when I look at that, I think, am I in stage 3? Or am I in
Totally.
stage 1? Then I hear this, give up all ideas of improving.
Totally.
So
Cecily's bringing up a really key point that always comes up, and it's that anything I can say about meditation is going to be a paradox, right? And again, I often teach in yoga studios, and so in a yoga studio, it's easy to demonstrate this because the question comes up, are you trying to achieve the pose or not, right? And the answer is yes and no, because as soon as I'm trying to achieve the pose, I lose the beauty of right where I am is the pose. You see what I mean? Wherever I find myself, that is the pose. After I used to be a bit of a yogi, and then after I herniated my disc, like my yoga practice looks very different, but where I'm at is the edge, and the edge is where yoga happens. You see what I mean? So it's not how it looks, right? So yes, I'm trying to achieve the pose, and at the same time, I'm not trying to achieve anything. So what Cecily's bringing up is, are you trying to achieve something in meditation? The answer is yes and no. It's a paradox. You can say, no, stop trying to achieve anything. But the problem with that just being too much in that category is then you'll just won't actually do the training. But if you're in the training category, any attempt to create a non-agitated state of mind is itself an agitation. So you're going to be just going in circles, and you're not going to actually learn to let go. So it is a paradox, and that's why it's so hard to talk about it, because anything I could say about it, I could do an entire another day and just contradict everything I've told you today. Just like so. I'm just it's this living form that we're trying to play within. Okay, so now working at it from this approach, now what is stage 4? What I'm working with stage 4? I'm working with now trying to permanently get rid of what's called gross dullness and gross agitation. And then, so particularly with gross agitation, like how would I work on combating gross agitation? One of the ways for both working with gross dullness and gross agitation is cultivating mindfulness in the way that I defined it. Optimal balance between attention and awareness. And let me just get, and then we'll kind of stop the chart for now, but let me give you one example of what that would look like. Okay, I want to work on gross agitation and dullness. I never lose the object, but the object I still have agitation and dullness that comes up. So the first thing we want to work on is agitation. How do I work on that? Periodically, and this helps with dullness too, periodically throughout the meditation, pause and just take a look around, not physically, but internally. How's my practice? Do I have dullness? Is my mind agitated? Just notice that. Like, where am I at with that? The ways agitation will show up is insight, as I mentioned earlier. You're like, oh wow, it must be related to this. Anytime we make connections, that's a type of insight. Insight is not bad, but it's a distraction in practice. Anytime you have light bulbs, it's like, oh my gosh, I never realized this. That's so interesting. It would apply to this as well. I got to tell this person about this. Those are all insights. Now, they might be legitimate insights, but they're a hindrance to your practice. They're just trivia. And I tend to, for me, practice is now more, I suffer from like, I feel like I'm having insight, And it just, can I drop that and just come back to presence with the object of meditation? And again, dullness we talked about is just gross dullness, We're just trying to get rid of that gross dullness. Now, as we move 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we're then drop gross dullness and gross agitation, and we move into working with subtle dullness and subtle agitation. Then stage 8, something really beautiful happens. We have, and these stages are talked about in slightly different ways in different traditions, but roughly they're the same. We have something called mental pliancy. It's an amazing thing that the mind is capable of. And then stage 9, we have mental and physical pliancy. And so mental and physical pliancy means that you no longer have any physical discomfort in the body. And you can put your mind on an object and keep it there with almost no effort at all, and it'll stay very, very clear on the object, and you can just hold it there. It's just like the tiniest effort to put your mind on the object, and then you back off of any effort. My very first time experiencing this, I was having severe back pain from my herniated discs. And it was amazing all of that went away, and I could sit for 3 or 4 hours with no effort, and this I think is how deep a mom must be able to do a 3-day sit, which I could never do. But when you're really resting in mental physical pliancy, the body feels totally at ease, totally comfortable. And the mind can just be placed on an object, and it's just effortless. And that feels fantastic. So then you're working on things of, then you start to work in the higher stages towards letting go of things like elation and illusions of grandeur and things like that. It just becomes a calming as opposed to a, so roughly that's how the practice unfolds. Any questions about any of that so far? I know it's a lot, yeah.
So now I feel like, I've been seduced by dullness.
Well, turns out you're not alone. Every one of us has, yeah.
I don't know a way to inquire about this. Should meditation then not have a feeling to it?
Not have a feeling. Yeah, it will have feelings come and go, but you don't have to pay attention to that.
Right, so.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
You say dullness feels fantastic.
Yeah, right.
Like, if I say, that meditation was great, it felt really good, am I just lying to myself that I was enrobed in dullness?
Yeah, and again, anything I could say I can contradict, but for this discussion, I would say possibly, yeah. And you don't want your meditation defined based on how it felt. You want your meditation.
How do you combat dullness, did you say?
What's that?
How do you combat dullness?
One, by committing to combating it. Intention has so much. Like, okay, I don't want to indulge in dullness anymore. And really the main thing, and remember what I said, is how do you combat anything? Really the main thing is just naming it, becoming aware of it. Do you remember G.I. Joe? He used to say naming is half the naming the problem is half the solution, or something like that. There was this G.I. Joe statement, is naming is half the battle. And I find this in the Rumpelstiltskin myth too, right? Because this woman gives up her child to this like demon, and he says she can have her child back if she names him, right? But his name is Rumpelstiltskin, so how's she ever going to name him? And then she's wandering through the forest, and it always, the fairy tales and also the Buddhist stories always have this moment where you have to go into absolute despair before you get the name, right? So she's in absolute despair, having lost her child. And it's at that moment of absolute despair, wandering in the wilderness, literally, and all of a sudden she sees a little cabin, and she listens, and she hears this little old man in the cabin. She'll never guess that my name is Rumpelstiltskin. Right? It's through that despair, and there's so many teachings in that. And the power of that is, all you need to do is name it. So there's a 1,000-degree difference between somebody who's sitting in dullness and doesn't even know dullness exists versus somebody who's sitting in dullness and been like, oh, I'm sitting in dullness. That's probably all you need to do, is just be able to name what's happening. Oh, there's dullness. And again, I remember I was talking to my brother about this, and I said, like, one way of finding dullness is to eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's. He's like, man, I should come to your classes. That's a great homework assignment. But really, like, overeat sometime, but do it intentionally, maybe it's a bad instruction, but when you know you're about to have a big meal, and just feel, if you haven't really overeaten, just feel the pleasantness of having a dull mind. And just be like, this feels pleasant. And then notice the territory. Yeah.
Yeah, reading this, and I love reading this, I'm aware that I'm a full range meditator.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another point. We will flip back, and that's the chutes and ladders idea. Now, the other thing to say is you might be at stage 1 for the next 15 years, and it doesn't mean you're a failed meditator, right? Again, awakening happens any moment. As an example of that, and then let's do a little sit, but as an example of that, we can look at Eckhart Tolle. Many of you know, who's a famous author right now. He was, his awakening experience, which is mappable under Buddhist articulations, but his awakening experience was he was in his bedroom, and he was suicidal because he was so depressed. He was not a meditator. He did not go through the stages, and he just thought, I can no longer live with myself. Okay, that was the main thought. Now, then the thought came of who are these two roommates? Who is the I that can no longer live with myself? And this is a key insight in Buddhism, that we make a mistake about how the I exists. And he thought, I can no longer live with myself. It's tricky, but there's a mistake that's being made in that statement. And that mistake, in that mistake is the foundation of human suffering. That was the Buddha's great discovery. We are making a mistake about how the I exists. And in that mistake is the foundation of human suffering. And that's what happened to Eckhart Tolle, because he said, who is the I that can't live with myself? And then all of a sudden he got insight into the mistake that was being made. And in that insight, he had a permanent cessation of certain mentally afflicted states. And that's what happens in practice. That's why we meditate, is to have that insight. And I know I just talked about not having insight, but here I'm paradoxing, contradicting. In that insight, you do have permanent cessations of certain mentally afflicted states. Not all of them, but certain ones of them. Yeah.
When you try to meditate, when you have mental or physical pain,
Yeah.
you focus on that.
Yeah, so that's,
Try to
yeah, there's,
work it through by relaxing.
yeah, the answer is a yes to all of that, right? It really depends, and there's a whole nother course we should do someday about just how to work with physical pain. But there's a way of not letting it be as a peripheral awareness, but staying with the object of meditation. So let's say I'm working with the breath, and I'm feeling excruciating back pain. I just use that as a peripheral awareness. And it can be very helpful in the way that a cell phone can be helpful of you won't dull out. You won't have a collapse of awareness because your awareness is very present. So there's a way that pain can be really helpful. Now, at one point in my practice, I had to switch my object to my back itself and use the back pain as the object of meditation. And it becomes a very useful tool in that way. I can honestly say that having acute chronic pain for a period of my life progressed me along the path more than anything else did. It was really, really beneficial.
How so?
What's that?
How?
Because, it's a little hard to explain the specifics in a simple way, but basically it's so present that it brings you into contact when you, two ways. One, it keeps you, brings you into mindfulness in a much deeper way. Again, because there's peripheral awareness and attention and awareness. You don't collapse awareness.
Right.
Because it's always there. And then when I moved my attention to it, there's a de-reification process happening, which is, there's that darn word again that we haven't defined.
That we haven't defined.
Yeah, and that's where the real progress comes for me. And so let's do a sit, let's take a break, and then let's finish up with talking
Then
about...
you're going to define reification?
And then we're going to finish up with nothing but reification. Because in a way, it's the most important part of the talks. So let's do a little sit, and then we'll take a break. All right, so now we're gonna do something a little bit different now. We're gonna try to stay with the object for the whole 10 minutes. And again, you'll notice this is, for most of us, this is not possible, which all that means is you have a healthy mind. Right? It doesn't mean you're a loser and you have to leave and never come back. Right? So it just means you have a healthy mind. So no problem. So what we're gonna do, and I'm not gonna lead it much, right? But I'm gonna pause us periodically. I'm gonna say, okay, pause. I'm gonna lead us into it, and I'm gonna lead us out of it, and then I'm gonna bring in a couple pauses. And that pause, all I want you to do is relax. Notice if you've increased tension, and most likely everyone in here will have increased tension. We're trying to focus, and we're not receiving, and tension will happen in the neck. A really interesting place tension happens is behind the eyes, the jaw. So I'm gonna pause us, and you just, when we pause, I just want you to relax and notice, what have I been mind wandering? Am I on the object? Am I in dullness? Whatever it is. And then just try to come back. So that's all we'll work on. So pick the object. Now that's a key thing. I recommend, if you don't already have an object you're working with, work with the breath in the area of like the belly, the abdomen. And try to find a physical sensation where you're feeling the breath. Again, if the breath is not a great option for you, work with the sensation of the palms of your hands. It doesn't really matter that much. Or if you're working with another object, that's fine. So first thing, let yourself stretch out. Appreciate having a couple moments. And then when you're ready, just come into relaxation. Let the mind wander for a moment. And just become present to the room. Like, listen to the sounds. There's a refrigerator humming, and just notice any sounds you can hear. But also notice your emotional state, your mental state. Notice if you're fatigued, and just gently name these things. Notice where you're at. And then now make contact with the object. Feel the sensation of the breath, if you're working with the breath, wherever you're working with it. Really make contact with that object. And then keeping some peripheral awareness, now start to receive the sensation of the breath. And let your mind just settle into that receptivity. And if the mind's wandered off already, or if you haven't made contact yet, just set a clear intention. This tiny bit of space I'm going to use to really work on this. And just come back to the making contact with the object. without moving, just pausing for a second. Just relax, notice the state of the mind. Rededicate to the practice, and then when you're ready, begin again. See if you can have about 50% of your attention on the object and 50% of your awareness on something like the church bells. So don't lose the object. Again, just pause for a moment. Just look around your mind. Notice if you're tired or agitated, just note that. And then return again for just a couple more minutes. And then without moving, just for the last 30 seconds, just drop everything. Drop anything you're doing. Just relax, staying still. Okay, great. All right, let's do just a pretty quick, because we have very little time, let's just do a quick 5-minute break. Okay, again, thank you so much for your endurance. We have a little more time, and I'm going to milk it for all it's worth, because I'm going to be gone and may never see you again, so you never know. So just let me just endure with me, and then my teacher used to always say, you can sleep on the plane, you know, like, I'd be like, I'm so tired. He's like, you sleep another day. But so we'll just go to the full 12:30, and a few more things I want to talk about. But before we do that, a couple of announcements. One is, if you'd like to be on my email list, I'll put it up here. We do online classes. I mostly try to do those for free, and they're mostly pondering together about specific topics. So if you'd like to be on that, you can also go to my website, willduncan.org. I meant to put that on the reading, but I forgot. All my classes are listed on there. Those of you on Instagram, you can find me on Will Duncan Classes. I just spoke at SUNY Purchase, and a group of 70 students, and the teacher said, raise your hand if you're on Facebook. Not a single hand was raised. I was shocked. I never got on Facebook, but I was like, wow, nobody's on Facebook. But I am on Instagram, and I just post my classes there.
What's that again?
That's Will Duncan Classes. And then so the farm has two personalities, or it's a slightly schizophrenic. It has just the lavender farm personality, and it has the kind of meditation component. And people don't often know that it's both. So the farm is run by a board of directors, a small board of directors, and that kind of more meditation component of it. But as a lavender farm, you can also find that on Instagram, and it's called Skull Valley Lavender. Skull like a skull of a head. I live in a tiny town. The town is about the size of the 5 boroughs of New York, but it has 100 people in it. So it's a lot of open land, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But Skull Valley, Arizona is where I live. Actually, now it's about 175 residents. It's really getting overcrowded these days. And if anybody's interested about that, Mary's come out, and she has spent time at the farm. She can give you a more honest portrayal. It is very, very rustic. Like, we have a little retreat cabin. It has no toilet. It has no electricity. It has no running water. So it's very rustic. And then we have pop-up trailers. Peggy, your old rector, she stayed in a pop-up trailer, and she was hardcore. I was a little nervous. She's like, no problem. She was out there doing physical labor with pickaxes and sleeping in this pop-up trailer with wild pigs surrounding her at night. And so she did great, but it is very rustic. And if you're interested in that, you can write me, and we can talk about that. We just recently, the website is taken down. I'm rebuilding all of my websites right now, but that website is sophiacommunity.com. And I'll write it up here. It's Sophia with an F, SOFIA, community.com. But you won't find much in there now. Oops, that marker is done. Yeah, but sophiacommunity.com. And then also, I wanted to, there's some meditations happening here. So I was wondering if Harry would just mention what's happening here that you can get involved in. And if you have a meditation, I think you're doing one still. Are you right now? Or? Yeah. Okay, great. So if you guys would both just, if you wouldn't mind quickly, and Harry, would you just...
Yeah, sure. You're welcome. More than welcome to register for the Trinity Meditation Room. It meets Sunday night only on learn some new methods and a chance to practice. It's multimedia. We use art and poetry. It's mostly a Christian focus. But 15 minutes of silent meditation, centering prayer, or whatever technique you wish to use. Wednesday night in the chapel, candlelit, which is wonderful, and online as well. Ethan does both, Sunday. And in the chapel, it's total silence of a half hour. So just a very
beautiful.
short prayer, and then we close with the Lord's Prayer. And if you miss a session, it doesn't really matter because you can always catch up. There's stuff put up on the screen to just guide you through the evening of 1 hour. Several of you in this room are present. You're more than welcome, but you must register to receive the Zoom invitation on the parish website or catch me there.
Great, thank you. Cecily, are you doing one right now, or?
Well, I lead a meditation group on Tuesday night online from 6. And the only requirement is that you let me know if you're not coming. It's a commitment, yes, but just to let me know if you're not coming, that's what we ask. There are 16 people, and they don't all show up every time by any means. And I do some teaching, usually something that I've read that interests me, and I share something that I've read with people, and then we talk about it. And then we meditate. If you want to get in touch with me, reach me afterwards, and I'll give you my email. How would you find my phone? Anybody find my email? Judy, in the group, she would have my email, so if you're a Trinity person, she's the person you could get in touch with and say, how do I get in touch with Cecily? I would welcome any and all of you. Sign up. Have fun.
And the other Bill Duncan can get you in touch with both of these people as well.
So Bill, could I just
Yeah,
make one quick comment?
yeah.
You know, in the early 80s, I got involved in a meditation group in Los Angeles. And the group had been together from, I think, the 1920s.
Yeah.
It had been passed down. And it was the philosophical movement in
Yeah,
San
yeah.
Diego. That was the origins. of the
Yeah.
group. And at that time, there was, a big issue with the Soviet Union, and it was before the Soviet Union collapsed. And the group had this mission to create a bridge of understanding between the people of the United States and the people of the Soviet Union. And some of them had a mission and went there and so on. And we worked on this bridge of understanding each time we came together. So it was a personal meditation and then a greater meditation. And it just occurred to me that, with all of what's going on in the Middle East, and this particular parish has been engaged with a lot of work. A previous rector, Bruce Porter, started something called the Jerusalem Peace Builders, and many of us support his group. It just occurred to me that if we, as a group, came together with a greater purpose, that might draw more people in and more energy to create more understanding.
Great, yeah.
So I think that could be a good motivation to bring more people in.
Great, thank you, yeah. Great, and so maybe if that's, somebody's heartstrings vibrate about that, maybe talk to you afterwards, or just bring that conversation alive a little more. All right, so how was that meditation? Anything come up for anybody that they want to share, or the one we did right before the break?
Really appreciated church bells, open awareness.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Made it, I don't want to say easy, but it made
Yeah,
it easier to have focus and
yeah, great, great. And you can play ratios, and I do this sometimes just for fun. So I try to do 20% attention on the sound of the refrigerator, and then like 80% awareness of everything else that's happening. Or I do 20% attention on the breath, 80% awareness, and then I switch the ratio. I do 80% attention and try to have 20% awareness. And just playing with the ratio of attention awareness is just a great exercise to start making us a little more flexible in that way. But yeah, the church bells, I was like, what perfect timing, you know? It was like, and it's not like you're normally, I mean, I forget what piece that is, but they're like full on going, and I was like, oh my God, we're going to go into like the Bach concertos next, you know? But it's just like, yeah, it's beautiful to do that.
I just wonder, you know, the neurologists say we can only really focus on one.
Mm-hmm.
So, is that possible simultaneously to do 50% awareness, 50% attention, or is it more like we going back and forth?
Yeah, according to the yogis and according to neurology, you're actually toggling.
Yeah.
But the toggling is so fast that it appears, so the whole idea of multitasking is not real, you know?
Right.
What we're doing is we're toggling attention. But we're doing it in this way, it's not multitasking because we're doing it in a relaxed way and we're trying to build that muscle of mindfulness. But it is a type of toggling. But it's happening so fast that it appears like we're aware and, you know, focused at the same time. Yeah.
And where does the mantra of the sacred word fit in?
So mantra would just be an example of an object of meditation. You know, and that's all. And again, so when we're talking about objects of meditation, I'm mostly talking about the breath. But for example, I've done twice now, I've done a Catholic practice called the Spiritual Exercises of St. Francis. And I did it very traditionally. It takes about 40 days and you're meditating hours a day. But what the object of meditation is in that exercise is different periods of Christ's life. So the object is actually a scene. Like filming a scene, you know, the scene is like scene of Jesus and Mary and Joseph in the stable. That's the object. So an object can be a scene. It can be a mantra. It can be many things. Now, how is a scene an object? Is because I'm trying to keep my mind in that perimeter. And then when my mind goes from that to something else, I've now lost the object. You see what I mean? And I'm bringing it back. So all these variations of different types of meditation, they're mostly just different types of objects. That's what I said. A lot of what we've been talking about can be transferred to any different type of meditation. I don't teach a type of meditation because I've realized we're all so different. So when I work with people, I figure, okay, what might work best for this person? Yeah. Yeah.
How does one defining?
It's super important to define the object. You said, how do you avoid defining it?
Right, that's the question, whether it should be avoiding.
Yeah. So in order to do, and again, I'm going to talk about it in a more linear way for a second, which is paradoxical in a way. But what I'm talking about here is training the mind, training the heart and the mind, and certain cognitive and emotional skills. In order to train, you have to have a very clearly defined object. You know, in other words, if I sit down to the piano and I'm like, I'll just do whatever I feel like, I'm not going to progress, right? If I don't have a clear, what am I working on today? What I'm working on today is the C scale and transposing that to different parts of the keyboard.
So how would you define?
So I would say I'm working with the object of the breath.
So you wouldn't,
First.
what is the breath? How do I define?
Great, and this is a perfect setup for reification. So thank you. So I think I understand your question a little bit more. So, so here's another thing that happened for me. 20 years, I thought I was making contact with the object of the breath. And after 20 years, I finally made contact with the breath and realized for the previous 20 years, I had never made contact with the breath. Now that might sound weird. What do you mean? I realized I was working with an idea of the breath, but I had not made contact with a de-reified sensation of the breath. So that's what I want to get into now. What is this idea of reification? Okay, so I'm going to come back to your question because I want to take reification and one more time put it on the side burner. And we will come back to that, because before I forget, I want to talk real quickly, because a couple people brought up pain again. I wanted to just talk a little bit more about pain, and then we're going to finish with reification with that exact question. So there's two ways, specific ways that you can work with pain that I wanted to share, because one is very, very profound. And I just definitely wanted to leave you with this. And again, it comes out of the Lojong tradition. Lojong comes out of 14th century Tibet. And it's a very beautiful tradition. It was kept secret for a very long time. And then it was brought into open teachings by a Lama in the 16th century. And so that's where we get a lot of our Lojong teachings. So here's how to work with pain from a Lojong perspective. And this will sound familiar to you in a Christian context. But let's say I'm dealing with very acute low back pain. Or let's say I'm dealing with a migraine or something like that. The practice is simply this. It's very simple. And it's why it was kept secret, because the simplicity, people would dismiss it. So you had to do all of these initiations and stuff, and then be told the big secret, and it was like, love others. And you're like, what? So here's the practice. The practice is, when I'm having a migraine, I simply imagine that my migraine is burning up anybody else's migraine in my vicinity. Or when my heart is broken, I imagine, I don't try to increase it. I don't say, let everybody's migraine come on me. There is a practice of that, and it's called Tonglen. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something different. The idea is, I'm already experiencing this pain. May this pain burn up anybody else who's experiencing this pain. Now, the benefit of learning this stage-based approach to meditation is like learning to read. It's learning a skill. Once you have that skill, then you can decide, what do I want to read? I mean, you could read romance novels or sci-fi, or, what you do with this skill of stability of attention is unlimited. So the other reason the Lojong teachings were kept secret is because you had to first develop stability of attention, go through the stages of meditation. Once you have stability of attention, the world looks radically different. And I propose it's as different as being illiterate and literate. Because when you're illiterate, you don't think that the world looks any different, right? You're like, well, what's learning to read? I remember I was teaching in China, in Shanghai, and I went out to try to get a meal, right? And I'm a vegetarian, and I was like, I ended up not eating that night because I couldn't read any menu, And the English menus were like, they were absurd. It was like nonsensical. It was like moss of a moth dipped in, chocolate. I'm like, I don't think that's really what this is, So I just ended up never eating. So being illiterate, like the world is closed off. And so I propose that as soon as you develop stability of attention, the world is as drastically different as being illiterate and becoming literate. And again, it's not essential. You can live a meaningful life, and you can live a spiritually advanced life without that, but it does open things up. Once you have stability of attention and you do this simple prayer practice of, may what's going on for me burn up what might be happening for anybody else, it has a potency that's very profound. I had a beautiful meeting one time in the Himalayas. I was in this tiny village called Zanskar, and it was untouched Tibetan Buddhism. It's part of India, so the Chinese didn't abolish the Buddhism there, and it was just untouched. Anyway, so I had a beautiful meeting trying to explain Christianity to this abbot of this beautiful monastery. And when I talked about like Jesus dying on the cross, it was so obvious to him. He's like, oh, he's doing this basic Lojong practice, right? Like Jesus dying for our sins, or that idea. And the Lojong practice is like, if I have a migraine, may my migraine eliminate your migraine. That's the basic practice. Now, do I really eliminate your migraine? That's a huge debate in the Tibetan monasteries. Anybody ever seen Tibetan debating? It's really fun. It's really active. You go like that, and like if I was debating Cecily, she can only say yes, no, doesn't apply. Like it's like playing chess. And then I'm trying to trap her with logic, right? It's a very kind of masculine thing, but it's super fun. And the idea is two people using this formula of debate can eventually get at the truth. And wrong views will get eradicated. Because of this world of conspiracy theories and misinformation, I've started a Buddhist debate team in my hometown, just to get a group of people trained in clarity of thought. But you would debate, like, oh, so can I get rid of your headache? You know, and it's that idea. And it's a fun debate, but we're not going to get into that. But that's beside the point. What you're actually doing is you're training your heart to open even in the midst of pain. And you're starting to be able to use your pain to open your heart. And if pain has meaning, it becomes a very different quality than meaningless pain. Carl Jung said, neurosis is pain that has no meaning. You know? And so really what this whole practice of and I've used it, and it's a very beautiful practice. The idea in the Lojong tradition is to get so good at it that at the moment of death, in Tibetan they say there's a particular pain and there's a particular fear that often comes up at death. It's short-lived, but it does arise. And they say if you can use the Lojong those at that point, it becomes very, very powerful. The fear of dying and the fear of pain, if you can then use that to benefit others, that dying process becomes profoundly meaningful. So really what you're doing is you're training in lesser pains, like a migraine or a low back pain or whatever. You're training in the lesser pains to use it for the more frightening pains. And then one more thing to say about that, the fear is diminished a little bit. I'll come to both your questions in a second, but let me touch on this equation. And this equation is a basic Buddhist equation. Pain times resistance equals suffering. So pain, if you've noticed, it's not optional. We are in bodies that feel, we are going to be experiencing pain, and we're all brothers and sisters in that. We're all siblings, and that we all have to go through a fairly serious level of pain and discomfort, right? But where the suffering comes in is when we have resistance to that pain. And we were talking about that on the break, but it's like if I have something happening, every time my low back goes out, I have a surge of resistance. Oh my God, I have so much to do this week, I cannot be incapacitated. And that resistance, my whole body seizes up and I suffer because that resistance has become so strong. And then what I do over the next week is I work through the resistance and I work to coming into the gifts that pain has to offer, even though it's inconvenient, even though I have to cancel this, and and it's just working through the resistance, and then I can experience the pain just for what it is without the resistance, and my level of suffering drastically decreases. Let me say that one more way, and then we'll move on and come to your questions. But one of my meditation teachers, wonderful teacher, who's passed away now from brain cancer, but he had his intestines blocked, a block of his intestines, and he was in a life-threatening situation. And his wife, thank God for so many of our partners, but his wife was the one to convince him to go to the emergency room. Because he was just meditating, and he's like, no, it's not a big deal, So he went to the emergency room. And I just saw this yesterday. You know that chart? It's like 1 through 10. Like 1, I feel happy, and it's like 2, I feel slightly uncomfortable, So it's like a level. So the nurse said to him, on a level of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? What's your level of pain? And he looked at the chart and he thought, I'm at like a level 2, right? I'm feeling fine, So he was triaged. He was just sitting in the emergency room for a long time, and then then he looked at the chart and he realized, oh, well, I feel fine, but I'm actually experiencing the worst pain I've ever experienced in my life. But what he had is he had no resistance, so he wasn't associated it with suffering. So his suffering level was very, very low. Basically, it was not suffering, and his pain level was the greatest it had ever been in his life. And he's like, oh, she's asking me this. She's not asking me this. So he called the nurse and he said, oh, I'm at a level 10. And she's like, oh my God, okay. So they rushed him in and he almost died. You know, his body was filling up with toxins and he was almost going into a kind of sepsis or something. So that's where he learned about this equation. And that's, the Buddha taught this idea. So really what we're working on with pain is we're working on the resistance because we have no option for this. I mean, some people claim that there's an option for that. I have my doubts. So I just wanted to touch on that. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. No, and again, that's the gift of pain when you can get rid of the resistance. You're very present. Yeah, and you realize, and I've realized this, that presence feeds you in a profound way, even when it's uncomfortable. It's more feeding of us than mind wandering. And yeah.
I just wanted to say how that comes up for me.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just around pain. It's when I hear myself saying, this shouldn't be happening.
Exactly.
And then luckily, Buddha's teaching is like, oh, this shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, really?
Yeah.
And then that equals suffering.
Yeah.
Even if it's not pain, it's just like the weather.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like, it shouldn't be like this.
Yeah, it shouldn't be raining because I had plans for a picnic.
Yeah.
All the things that have that sentence. And,
Yeah.
triggers for me. I know I've stepped into that place.
Yeah, totally.
And I just wanted to ask you, the sentences around fear, I understand, may my pain from my migraine burn out all the pain of other people's heads or bodies. What about my fear of dying?
Exactly, same thing.
May my fear burn out the fear?
It doesn't have to be physical, it can be emotional. May my heart break, may my fear, I'm already feeling it, so may it burn up anybody else's fear here. Yeah. Now the question of does it really do that? I really don't know. I mean, I think it's a little too metaphysical of a statement to say it does, but I will tell you, one time I was having a really bad migraine, and I have a friend who has constant migraines. So all night long, I just was working with him. May he have no migraine, may he have no insomnia, and I hadn't seen him in months, and by total coincidence, I ran into him the next day. I said, hey, how's everything going? He's like, man, I don't know what happened, but I had the best sleep of my life last night. And I very accept that could be coincidence, but I just thought it was so wonderful. It's like, wow, what a coincidence.
And we could imagine Jesus saying the same thing on the cross.
Totally, yeah. And so it's such a...
I sacrifice my love burn.
Right, yeah.
All.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if
Yeah, totally, 100%, yeah. I did have in my notes to start the whole day today about grief, but notes get thrown out the window sometimes. But I do have, and I'll maybe I'll leave this as an open question. I have come to realize that it's very hard to progress along the path of meditation until you have a hearty relationship with the ability to grieve. And the question is, what does grieving have to do with meditation? That's the kind of question I want to leave you with, but I want to give you a couple more clues in that question. If I talk about meditation as an intimacy practice, okay, let me ask you this, why would we block ourselves from intimacy? Yeah, because it hurts, vulnerability. It is vulnerable to be intimate. It's vulnerable to love, right? So of course we're going to block. So if we don't know how, and the problem with vulnerability is you will get hurt. We have to lose everything we love, our lives. What I didn't say is I'm also a hospice chaplain, and I've been doing that for a number of years. So I have the gift of midwifing people through the dying process. And, you think about how uncomfortable it is to lose your phone and your wallet, And I remember one day sitting with a man who was actively dying, and I realized he's losing his wallet, his phone, his daughter, his wife. I mean, you realize, wow, I hadn't put it in that context. Because I know how distressing it is. I had just recently lost my phone. I left it in a cab. And I was like, it was distressing, And I'm like, oh, this man, it just gave me a new aspect of understanding, really what we're talking about. We're talking about the immensity of we have to lose everything. Every relationship ends, whether it's the pain of a loss of an intimacy or the pain of death, right? So I've realized that really to progress on the path is learning to have a relationship with death. And not just with death, rather, but with grief. Learning to have a relationship with grief. So 2 more little pieces to throw into there before we finally get to reification. And we're doing fine on time, so that's great. Well, let me ask you, what does that mean? How does one have a vibrant relationship with grief? What do you think? How does one learn how to grieve? I will tell you, it's not the 5 stages of grief or anything. That's helpful to an extent, but it doesn't, again, it's like the linear idea of meditation. Grief doesn't unfold in that way.
Try not to be afraid of it.
Okay, try not to be afraid. What else?
Accept that it exists.
Okay, yeah, accept that it exists. Great, what else?
Surrender.
Surrender, yeah. I think that's the real one, right? Because
allowing the depth of those feelings.
yeah. I think
Now, that's being alive.
yeah.
If I couldn't grieve, would I be alive?
Yeah, exactly. So surrender. Yeah, what were you gonna say?
My brother and his wife just had a loss, and he said to us on the phone, the good thing about touching bottom is at least you learn where it is.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I thought,
Mm-hmm. There's a mantra that one of my mentors taught me in hospice work, and he said, don't try to help and don't turn away. And that's a really interesting balance. And that's exactly what we're doing in meditation too, right? Because why should I not try to help? Because mostly when I'm trying to help, what I'm trying to do is mitigate my own anxiety. And you see this again and again. So in my hospice work, I'm also do bereavement calls, but I'm also working with family. And you're working with a lot of anxiety in the family that's not giving that person space to go through their own process. And so that's really the mantra I found with learning to have a relationship with grief. Don't try to help and don't try to turn away from your own grief. Which means for me, when I'm grieving, don't try to diminish it. Don't try to just look on the sunny side. Or, don't try to get over it. But also don't turn away from it, right? Again, both of those are reactive stances. Can I just be present with as beautiful teacher Joan Halifax says, can you be present with the whole catastrophe? And that's really what we're dealing with. Can we be present with the whole catastrophe? The other way that I've worked with grief is, I think for me, it simply comes down to making space to feel uncomfortable. And all the ways we try to block ourselves from that spaciousness. And you might be like, well, I have a busy life, I don't have space for that, But really, it's just a matter of periodically throughout the day, kind of like what Cecily was saying, is periodically throughout the day when I'm grieving, I will pause and I'll just soften. And what's amazing is as I soften, I feel this torrent of grief start to come up. And you can feel it, right? It's, when you're about to cry, somebody's saying something, you're about to cry. It's this pranic upward movement. It's like this, you can feel it as this upward movement. And then usually we press that down. I don't want to feel that right. I don't have time right now. If I start crying, I will never stop, right? All of those ways. And can you just create space to allow the grieving to happen? When I've made space for that, I'll be going through life and I feel like there's nothing really coming up very directly for me to feel grief around. And I'll just make a little space and there's endless amounts of grief. You know, there's so much grief. I mean, just turning on the news right now, the amount of images we've all seen, the grief is enough for the next 10 years, right? So we all have plenty to grieve, but we don't often make space for it. And again, that's why people are resistant to meditation, because that quieting down is terrifying, because what starts to fill in that void is heartbreak. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, is that the grief is an essential part of this whole process. And especially some of you that are a little bit older, some of your generation had this delusion of like, don't cry, you know, cowboy up. Well, I can tell you, I live with cowboys. I mean, and it's beautiful. Most of my life is with ranchers, uneducated, hardworking ranchers. And these are literally people that spend most of the day in the saddle. They have a real quality that the Tibetans have. And cowboys cry a lot. I mean, it's amazing. These tough Marlboro men, they cry quite freely, but they also, and I think it's a kind of sacred masculinity, they also don't cry when there's a crisis that needs to be dealt with. You see what I mean? So if there's a calf that's completely entangled in barbed wire, whether it's a cowgirl or a cowboy, they have an ability the cowboy up has an ability to go, get their rifle and shoot the cattle, you know? But I can promise you, when they go to bed at the end of the day, they're weeping for that cattle, right? So the cowboy up thing there's a use for it in the moment when something needs to be dealt with, you know? But there's a real, in my experience with both the Tibetans and the cowboys, and I've really seen a cross between those two worlds. It's fascinating. There's a real ability to feel and to grieve heartedly, which I find so admirable. And then again, that toughness comes in just that ability to be tough when you need to. As a quick aside, I was teaching yoga in my neighborhood for any of the ranchers that wanted to learn yoga. You know, and surprisingly, people showed up. And one woman, I remember, she showed up one day for yoga, and she was wearing tight Wranglers and that were covered in blood, you know. And I was like, interesting. It's not quite Lululemon, you know. It's like an interesting yoga outfit. And I said, wow, you have a lot of blood. She's like, yeah, I've been castrating bulls all morning. I was like, wow, this is a very different yoga class than you'd see in Williamsburg, you know? It's like, wow. All right, so finally, let's talk about reification. So I propose, and I kind of left this at the end for a purpose, but I propose this word is the most important word in your spiritual vocabulary. It comes from the Latin root re, which means thing. So reify, we can think about is to thingify something. What do you think that means? Any ideas? Anybody have an idea? What does it mean to thingify something? Any examples?
Depersonalize it, take all the juice out.
Yeah, beautiful. Depersonalize it. Turn it into an object. How do we do that? What are some examples of ways we do that?
Action.
Yeah, okay, abstraction. What else?
We also do that to protect our vulnerability.
100%, yeah.
Distance.
Yeah, distance. So try to feel, just in your body for a second, try to feel like an energetic level, the difference between the two statements I'm about to make, okay? That person is an addict. Okay, just get a sense. Okay, that's one statement. That person is struggling with addiction. You see, the difference is subtle, but when I just reified that person, I told you who that person is. They are an addict, right? That's a reification. Versus, that person is struggling with addiction. Oh, that person is mentally ill, versus that person is struggling with some mental illness issues. Doesn't one feel more like that's who they are? That's where they will always be, right? That's a reification. So what the mind does, the mind is constantly reifying things. It's thingifying things. So many of you know the wonderful physicist who's very popular right now because he's a wonderful writer, Carlo Rovelli. Anybody know that name? Yeah, so Carlo Rovelli, he's a gravitational physicist. And here's what he says. He says, we used to think the world was made of things and happenings. We used to have this dichotomy. There's things in the world and there's happenings. And he said a thing would be an example of like a stone, and a happening would be an example of something like a kiss. So we used to, so you can say, hey, do you know where that stone is? I brought that stone. Do you know where I put it? But we can't really say, do you know where that kiss is? We had it yesterday and I can't find it anywhere. Like I looked under the bed, I looked in the bathroom, like where is that, right? So we make this dichotomy of these two things. He says, but now what me and my colleagues have discovered is that there are no things. There's only happenings working in more expansive senses of time. A stone is just a happening that looks frozen to us for a moment, but is not frozen, it's dynamic and moving. It's just moving at a slower pace. I have a wonderful relationship with a bunch of natural historians, and we do events at the farm and stuff. And so they were coming out and talking about the pollinators, and they were teaching me that certain bees see something like they have the visual processing that's 20 times faster than we are. So we look like the, we're like, and you're like, and they're so fast you can barely ever see them, right? So again, so they're seeing even more things because they're moving so fast. If we move slower, right, we would just see this dynamic movement through time. So he says, what we've realized is there are no things, there are only happenings. So when we're talking about reification, or when we're talking about de-reification, we're talking about the moving from things to happenings. Now the question is, who cares? And I think it's the most important spiritual question we can always ask. Like, we always got to come back to who cares. But Cecily,
David Bohm cares.
Yeah, right, yeah. All these physicists are...
All the physicists
Yeah,
care because they say that we're connected to everything through a biofield.
Yeah.
And the biofield sustains us, maintains us.
Yeah.
So we're connected to all things that have vibration.
Yeah.
And stone has vibration.
Totally.
And all things that live.
I think we see this in physics, but I also propose we see it in Christianity, we definitely see it in Buddhism, and we definitely see it in Vedanta. I think these three areas are really rich with the insight of why this matters, okay? So let me, by way of kind of now finishing up with this idea of why does this matter, let me, if you don't mind, tell you a quick story. So I was in retreat, I was about my second year into retreat. And some of you heard this story, I told it in this same room, I think you heard this story, but 8 years ago. But I'm laying in retreat and I'm looking up at the ceiling. And so I started my retreat day at 3 a.m. every morning. It was what was my first meditation session. So I'm waking up, it's like 2:50, and the room's dark, and I just see a big black splotch right above my head on the ceiling. That's not a comforting thing to see, right? So I get my headlamp and I flash it on there, and it was the largest, most terrifying insect I've ever seen in my life. I didn't have internet, obviously, so I didn't know what it was until another 2 years. But it turned out to be a creature called a whip scorpion. Ew. Go home and look them up. Don't do it before bed, though. But they're about this big, and they're like a cross between a scorpion and a lizard. They have the tail of a lizard, and they're just massive legs with claws. And I was totally freaked out. I was like, retreat's over. I'm out of here. I didn't know these, I didn't know what it was. I'd lived in the desert most of my life. I had no idea what this was. I didn't know if it was going to kill me or anything. So I eventually got it in a jar, which was, my whole body was like this, and I was like just really not having a great time with that. And I brought it out into the evening, morning stars, right? And where I did retreat in the Chiricahua Mountains, it's just like beautiful night sky, just so vivid, no lights for hundreds of miles, And I had this moment happen that was so interesting. So what happened was, there I am holding this thing, and I'm literally shaking because I'm so freaked out. And I look up at the night sky, and I just see the full Milky Way. And every now and then, it's cliche to say it, but every now and then you just really are full of the awe of what we're actually dealing with. Like we're literally on, like in some side neighborhood of the galaxy, and we're on a little planet, and nobody has any idea what we're doing, and we're just like, it's just the tininess of it and the magnificence. And all of a sudden, my heart just completely broke open for love for this fellow earthling. Like I realized you and I are exactly the same. We're just on Earth. And we're like, I don't know any more about what I'm doing than you do. And I felt him as a brother. And I even had this thought sneak into my head that I'm going to bring him back into my room because I don't want anything to happen to him. It was like slightly absurd, right? I didn't, by the way. But, and then what happened is my mind then switched again to like, no, this thing is disgusting. Right? And so what happened over the next 5-10 minutes, as I just sat there in this very weird state, is my mind moved back and forth very quickly in a way that I was able to observe the moving. And you got to remember, I'm 2 years into a meditation, so I'm able to be an observer consciousness for a lot of the functioning of the mind. So there was a Jane Goodall part of me that was just watching what's happening with the reactivity around a frightening experience. And what I saw for the first time in my life is the reification and the de-reification process happen over and over again. And here's the interesting thing. So, right, the reification was what? What would the reification of that be? Yeah, yeah, enemy. I mean, the reification was really enemy. Bad person, enemy, right? What would the de-reification be? Yeah, that is a fellow earthling. Yeah, a fellow loved one, really, you know. And it was the opening of the heart. So energetically, it was contraction and expansion. And that's what reification is, a contraction, and de-reification is an expansion. But here's where it gets interesting. What I observed is every time I contracted, I had a reduction of anxiety. So interesting. Let me say that again. Every time I contracted, every time I reified, every time I labeled enemy, anxiety was reduced. I was more at ease because I had a clarity of enemy. And then every time I opened and I expanded, I had an increase of anxiety, which is also another way of saying that is an increase of vulnerability. And I realized labeling enemy it creates a reduction of anxiety. Watch the news with that mindset. And watch how, on one level, the news creates anxiety and then tries to, because it's a false reduction of anxiety. Do you see what I mean? It appears to be a reduction of anxiety, but it actually, there's a secret anxiety that's creeping up underneath that. I was like, okay, there's more enemies. I have to be more careful, you know. But watch the news. The news is all about reifying human beings as enemies, as good and bad. Yeah, the old us and them trick, you know. And it was so blatant, of course, back in like you were talking about Russia, and you know, back in the day when you see propaganda posters, right, and the enemy is always like snaggle-toothed, and like, you know, the Russians were like, you know, they're gonna eat your children, and you know, but that's what we do to enemies. We reify them and then deform them, distort them. And again, I'm proposing that creates a reduction of anxiety, which is such a weird thought to think about. So what we learn in meditation is we actually learn to be able to endure the discomfort of a de-reified perspective. In meditation, we learn to endure the discomfort of a de-reified perspective, which also means we increase internal freedom. Because every labeled enemy is a reduction of your freedom. And you know this. You're walking down Southport Boulevard or whatever. You see somebody that irritates you. What's physically happening in your body when you're like, oh my God, I have to interact with this person? There's a contraction. Yeah, you contract. Are you more free or less free than you were 5 minutes ago, right? You're less free. You're contracted. The Tibetans have a funny saying. They say, when you label enemy, it's like eating rat poison and waiting for the rats to die. My contraction, let's say Mark and I are in an argument, right? My contraction, it doesn't hurt Mark. All I'm doing is hurting myself, I'm contracting myself. So, really what we're talking about with meditation is ultimately, right? Meditation is, it's being marketed as like feel good and feel better, and I think there's a lot of problems to that. The real benefit of meditation is wake up to the ways that the mind is keeping us from freedom. And this is where St. Teresa comes in so beautifully. She has a model of the spiritual life being like, she says, like basically an agave plant or an onion, the different layers around it. And in the center of the onion is Christ, right? Christ consciousness, a full union with the divine, right? And on the outer levels are are different layers that we have to get through. And she says the thing is, and she uses the analogy of Christ playing a flute, which is very Krishna, by the way, because Krishna plays a flute. And that's how he draws people into the spiritual life, is through the beauty of the flute. Who is it? Graham, who wrote the Toad and Frog and Toad?
Yeah, oh boy. I can't remember the author, but.
Wonderful Christian writer who wrote that. And he's also bringing in this metaphor, because at one point, frog or toad, it's something green. Graham Greene, I think it is. No? All right, anyway. But so at one point, frog or toad, I forget which one. Go back and read it, it's wonderful. But they hear a flute that opens their heart. And it's just like, and we've all had that moment where we suddenly feel realigned, and oftentimes it happens with grief. Grief oftentimes realigns us to like, wow, what have I been wasting my time focusing on all this time? It's like, Kenneth Graham, yeah, great. Yeah, Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Graham. Wonderful book. But so it's like, those wake-up moments, and oftentimes they're a health scare, they're a frightening diagnosis, but they're that moments of like, it's wake up now. What am I wasting my time on? And that's what St. Teresa talks about with the flute at the center of, sometimes she calls it a castle too. The centermost room of this castle is when we hear Christ's flute. And we're drawn into that through all of these, she says, like these outer rooms full of serpents and scorpions, and which is just all the drama that everything you see on the news. It's just drama. You're gonna get the news that you need to get. We have this illusion that if we don't watch the news 24/7, we're not being responsible citizens. I completely reject that. I 100% reject that. I think what we're doing when we watch the news is we're just training the mind in reification. We're training the mind to limit capacity. I've done experiments where for 1 week, I'll watch Fox News. And then for 1 week, I'll watch like CNBC or something, And by the end of each week, I'm like, oh my God, the liberals are crazy. Oh my God, the conservatives are crazy. But I happen to be in a unique position where I am very surrounded by both extremes. I have, both extremes of that. And guess what? We're all human beings, right? And we all love our families. We all are frightened about things that are happening. There's so much humanity there that we forget. I oftentimes, I happen to be around a lot of people that are called, are transgender, because I have a lot of young people come to the farm. And when I hear people that are disturbed by that, I'm like, how many transgender people have you gone out to lunch with? And if that's a disturbing concept for you, I think find somebody to go out to lunch, and just like, or whatever it is that triggers you, whatever it is where you feel yourself start to contract, like get out of the news and go meet them and see where they're really at. And again, what we're talking about is the de-reification process. And that's all I have to share. Yeah, so thank you all so much. And really, thank you for your endurance. We just covered so much material that it's ridiculous. So here's what I recommend. If there's a group of you, it's really helpful to go back and revisit this within a week or so. This is how I was trained to study in the monasteries. You don't just put the notes away, but you particularly don't revisit it on your own. Find somebody to have a cup of tea with, and just go back through each point and kind of remind yourself. And then you really start to integrate the material.
So good.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you. I just want to say to everybody before we part, first off, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, you promised an introductory course, and like all introductory courses, I think that there were many different levels here. It's like a dance class where you've got Baryshnikov and also beginners. I hope this is the first of many interactions. I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah.
And then for the rest of the group, we do have a couple events coming up. I mentioned one last night, which is on November 4th, Women Wellness Summit. That actually is coming together like gangbusters. A committee of about 20 women are now promoting it, and I think it's going to be an unbelievable experience. So you might want to check out that. And then I think we might also be going on a field trip to the cloisters on December 2nd.
Wow.
For the only contemplative corner of Manhattan during Christmas. So we'll try and, I'll be getting some information about that too, but mark your calendars. We'll try to make that happen. Saturday, December 2nd.
And let me say just one more thing. I also if anybody's ever interested or you know somebody, I also do one-on-one work, and you can find out more about that on my website. There's a little link on what that means and what that looks like. So I just invite you to do that. And I'm at willduncan.org. And I hope to see you again at some point. Yeah, so thank you all.